Chapter 12, Part 1 of Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rasco. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 12, Part 1 of Nana. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and Nana and the Count, in the big bed hung with Venetian lace, were not yet asleep. He had returned that evening after sulking for 3 days. The room, which was only feebly lighted by a lamp, was wrapped in silence, and felt warm and moist with an odor of love, whilst the white lacquer furniture, inlaid with silver, was only vaguely visible. A drawn curtain half hid the bed in a flood of shadow. There was a sigh, and then the sound of a kiss broke the silence. And Nana, gliding from under the clothes, remained seated for an instant on the edge of the bed with her legs bare. The Count, his head fallen back on the pillow, continued in the shadow. "Darling, do you believe in God?" she asked, after a moment of reflection, with a grave look on her face, and filled with a religious terror on leaving her lover's arms. Ever since the morning she had complained of an uneasiness, and all her stupid ideas, as she called them, ideas of death and hell, had been secretly tormenting her. On some nights, childish frights and the most horrible fancies seized upon her, with her eyes open. She resumed, "Do you think I shall go to heaven?" And she shivered, whilst the Count, surprised at these singular questions at such a time, felt all his religious remorse awakened within him. But with her night-dress slipped from her shoulders, her hair hanging loose about her, she fell upon his chest, sobbing and clinging to him. "I'm afraid to die! I'm afraid to die!" He had all the difficulty in the world to get free from her. He himself was afraid of succumbing to the attack of madness from which that woman, pressed to his body in the contagious fear of the invisible, was suffering, and he reasoned with her. She was in very good health. All she had to do was to conduct herself well, to merit pardon hereafter. But she shook her head. No doubt she never did harm to anyone. She even always wore a medal of the Virgin, which she showed him hanging to a red ribbon between her breasts. Only it was settled beforehand all women who, without being married, had anything to do with men went to hell. Fragments of her catechism were returning to her. Ah, if one only knew for certain! But there one knew nothing. No one ever returned with news, and really it would be stupid to put oneself out if the priests were only talking nonsense. Yet she devoutly kissed her medal, which was all warm from its contact with her body, as a conjuration against death, the thought of which filled her with an icy terror. Muffat had to go with her into the dressing-room. She trembled at being alone for a minute, even with the door open. When he got into bed again, she wandered about the room looking into all the corners, and starting at the least sound. As she came to a mirror, she stopped before it as in the old days, lost in the contemplation of her nudity. But the sight only increased her fear. She ended by leisurely feeling the bones of her face with both her hands. "How ugly one looks when one's dead," said she slowly. And she drew in her cheeks, opened wide her eyes, and dropped her jaw to see how she would look. Then, with her features thus distorted, she turned to the Count and said, "Just look, my head will be so small." Then he grew angry. "You are mad. Come to bed." He could picture her in a grave, with the emaciation of a century, and joining his hands he muttered a prayer. For some time past religion had regained possession of him. His attacks of faith every day had the violence of apoplectic fits, and left him without the least strength. His fingers snapped, and he continually repeated these words, "My God, my God, my God." It was the cry of his impotence, the cry of his sin, against which he was powerless to resist, in spite of the certainty of his damnation. When Nana returned to the bed, she found him lying under the clothes with a haggard look on his face, his nails digging into his chest, and his eyes gazing upwards as though seeking for heaven. And she burst out crying again. They embraced each other, their teeth chattering without their knowing it, both being oppressed by the same absurd nightmare. They had once before passed a similar night, only this time they were utterly idiotic, as Nana herself declared when she got over her fright. A suspicion caused her to skillfully question the Count. Perhaps Rose Mignon had sent the famous letter. But it wasn't that. It was merely his nerves, nothing more, for he was still without proofs of his cuckoldom. 2 days later, after a fresh disappearance, Muffat called one morning, a time at which he had never come before. He was livid, his eyes were red with weeping, and his whole frame was still shaking from a great internal struggle. But Zoe herself, utterly scared, did not notice his agitation. She ran to meet him and cried, "Oh, sir, be quick! Madame very nearly died last night." And as he asked for particulars, she added, "Oh, something incredible, sir! A miscarriage!" Nana was 3 months enceinte. For a long time she had thought she was merely unwell. Dr. Boutarel himself had doubts. Then, when he was able to say for certain, she was so vexed that she did everything she could to hide her condition. It seemed to her a most ridiculous mishap, something which lowered her in her own estimation, and about which everyone would have chaffed her. What a wretched joke! She had no luck, really. It was just her misfortune to be caught when she thought she was quite safe. And she experienced a constant surprise, as though disturbed in her sex. What? One got children even when one did not want them, and had another object in view? Nature exasperated her. That grave maternity which rose in the midst of her pleasures, that new life quickening when she was sowing so much deaths around her. Ought not one to be able to dispose of oneself as one liked, without all that fuss? Now, who did the brat spring from? She could not for the soul of her tell. No one had asked for it. It was in everybody's way, and it would not meet with much happiness in life, that was quite certain. So he gave the story of the catastrophe. Madame was seized with colics towards 4 o'clock. When I went into the dressing-room, not having seen her for some time, I found her lying on the ground in a swoon. Yes, sir, on the ground, in a pool of blood, as though she had been murdered. Then, I understood what had happened. I was furious. Madame ought to have told me of her mishap. Monsieur Georges happened to be here. He helped me to raise her, but when I told him she had had a miscarriage, he became unwell also. Really, I've been in an awful stew ever since yesterday. And indeed the house seemed topsy-turvy. All the servants were continually running about the rooms and up and down stairs. Georges had passed the night on a chair in the drawing-room. It was he who had told the news to Madame's friends, who had called in the evening, at the time when Madame usually received. He was very pale, and he related the story full of astonishment and emotion. Steiner, La Falloise, Philippe, and several others had called. At his first words they uttered exclamations. It could not be. It must be a joke. Then they became very serious. They glanced at the bedroom door, looking very much put out, shaking their heads, no longer thinking it a funny matter. Up to midnight 12 gentlemen had conversed in undertones in front of the fireplace, all of them friends, and each one wondering if he were the father. They seemed to be apologizing to one another, with the confused looks of awkward people. Then they assumed their airs again. It was nothing to do with them. It was her fault entirely. She was a scorcher, that Nana. One would never have expected such a joke from her. And they went off one by one, on tiptoe, the same as in the chamber of death, where one must never laugh. "But you'd better go up all the same, sir," said Zoe to Muffat. "Madame is much better. She will see you. We are expecting the doctor, who promised to call again this morning." The maid had persuaded Georges to go home to obtain some sleep. Upstairs in the drawing-room there was only Satin reclining on a sofa, smoking a cigarette and gazing at the ceiling. Since the accident In the midst of a distraction of the household, she had displayed a cold rage, shrugging her shoulders and saying most ferocious things. So as Zoe passed before her, telling Muffat that her mistress's sufferings had been very great. "It serves her right. It will be a lesson for her," she sharply exclaimed. They turned around in surprise. Satin had not moved. Her eyes were still fixed on the ceiling. Her cigarette was held nervously between her lips. "Well, you haven't much feeling, you haven't," said Zoe. But Satin, sitting up on the couch, looked furiously at the Count and flung her former words in his face. "It serves her right. It will be a lesson for her." And she laid herself down again, slowly puffing the smoke from her mouth, as though uninterested and determined not to mix herself up in anything. No, it was too absurd. Zoe ushered the Count into the bedroom. The smell of ether hung about in the midst of a lukewarm silence, which the rare vehicles of the Avenue de Villiers scarcely broke with a dull rumbling sound. Nana, looking very white on the pillow, was not asleep. Her eyes were wide open and thoughtful. She smiled, without moving, on catching sight of the Count. "Ah, ducky," murmured she slowly, "I thought I should never see you again." Then, when he bent forward to kiss her on her hair, she was moved and spoke to him of the child in good faith, as though he had been the father. "I did not dare to tell you. I felt so happy. Oh, I had all sorts of dreams. I wanted it to be worthy of you. And now it's all over. Well, perhaps it's best so. I don't want to saddle you with any encumbrance." He, surprised at that paternity, stammered out a few sentences. He had taken a chair and seated himself beside the bed, one arm lying on the clothes. Then the young woman noticed his agitated countenance, his bloodshot eyes, the feverish trembling of his lips. "What's the matter with you?" asked she. "Are you ill also?" "No," he answered painfully. She gave him a penetrating look. Then with a sign she sent off Zoe, who was arranging the bottles of medicine as an excuse for remaining in the room. And when they were alone, she drew him towards her, saying, "What's the matter, darling? Your eyes are full of tears. I can see them. Come, speak. You have called to tell me something." "No, no, I swear to you," he stammered. But, choking with suffering, affected all the more by that sick room in which he so unexpectedly found himself, he burst into sobs. He buried his face in the sheets to stifle the explosion of his anguish. Nana understood. Rose had, no doubt, ended by sending the letter. She let him cry a while. The convulsions that had seized him were so violent that they shook her in the bed. At length, with an accent of maternal compassion, she asked, "You have some worry at home?" He nodded his head. She paused again, then added very low, "So you know all?" He nodded his head a second time. And silence again reigned, an oppressive silence in that room of pain. It was the night before, on returning from a party at the Empress's, that he had received the letter written by Sabine to her lover. After a frightful night passed in dreaming of vengeance, he'd gone out early in the morning to withstand the temptation to kill his wife. Outside in the open air, struck by the mildness of the beautiful June morning, he'd been unable to collect his scattered ideas, and had come to Nana's as he always came when in trouble. There only he would abandon himself to his misery, with the cowardly joy of being consoled. "Come, be calm," resumed the young woman affectionately. "I have known it for a long while, but I would never have opened your eyes. You recollect last year you had suspicions. Then, thanks to my prudence, things got all right again. In short, you had no proofs. Well, today, if you have any, it's certainly hard, as I can understand. Yet you must be reasonable. One's not dishonored because of that." He no longer wept. Shame had possession of him, though he had for a long time past talked with her about the most intimate details of his married life. She had to encourage him. Come, she was a woman. She could hear everything. But he muttered in a hollow voice, "You're ill. I mustn't tire you. It was stupid of me to come. I'm going." "But no," said she quickly. "Stay. I may be able to give you some good advice. Only don't make me talk too much. The doctor has forbidden me to do so." He had left his seat and was walking about the room. Then she questioned him. "What will you do now?" "I will thrash the man, of course." She pouted disapprovingly. "That's not a very smart thing to do. And your wife?" "I shall sue for a separation. I have a proof." "My dear fellow, that's not smart at all. It's even absurd. You know I'll never let you do anything of the kind." And sedately, in her feeble voice, she pointed out to him the useless scandal of a duel and a lawsuit. For a week he would be the chief topic in all the papers. He would be playing with his entire existence, his peace of mind, his high position at court, the honor of his name. And why? To be laughed at. "What does it matter?" cried he. "I shall be avenged." "Ducky," said she, "when a man doesn't avenge himself at once in such matters, he doesn't avenge himself at all." The words he was about to utter died away on his lips. He was certainly no coward, but he felt that she was right. An uneasiness increased within him. Something like a feeling of impoverishment and shamefulness had unmanned him in the outburst of his wrath. Besides, she hit him another blow, with a frankness that decided on telling all. "And would you like to know what it is that bothers you, darling? It is that you yourself deceive your wife. You don't stop out all night to say your prayers. Your wife must know the true reason. Then with what can you reproach her? She will say that you gave her the example, and that will shut you up. There, darling, that's why you're here stamping about instead of being there murdering them both." Muffat had fallen into a chair, overwhelmed by that brutality of language. She remained silent a while, regaining breath. Then she faltered in a very low voice, "Oh, I'm sore all over. Help me to raise myself a little. I keep slipping down. My head is too low." When he had assisted her, she sighed and felt better, and she returned to the grand sight of a trial for judicial separation. Could he not conceive the Countess's counsel amusing all Paris in talking of Nana? Everything would be related. Her fiasco at the Variety Theatre, her mansion, her life. Ah, no, she did not care for such an advertisement. Some dirty women might have urged him to be so foolish, so as to gain notoriety at his expense. But she desired his happiness before everything. She had drawn him towards her. She held him now, with his head on the pillow beside her own, and her arm round his neck, and she whispered gently, "Listen, Ducky, you must make it up with your wife." He was indignant. "Never!" His heart was breaking. The shame was too great. She, however, tenderly insisted, "You must make it up with your wife. Come, you don't want to hear everyone say that I estranged you from your family. It would give me too bad a reputation. What would everyone think of me? Only swear that you'll always love me, for now that you're going to be another's." Her sobs were choking her. He interrupted her with kisses, saying, "You are mad. It is impossible." "Yes, yes," resumed she, "you must do it. It's only right. And, after all, she's your wife. It's not as though you were unfaithful to me with the first woman you came across." And she continued thus, giving him the best advice. She even talked of God. He seemed to be listening to Monsieur Venot when the old man used to sermonize him to save him from sin. She, however, did not talk of breaking off. She preached complacency, the sharing of him by his wife and his mistress, a quiet life, without any bother for anyone, something like a happy dozing through the inevitable nastinesses of life. It would change nothing in their existence. He would still be her best-loved ducky, only he would not come quite so frequently, and would devote to the Countess the days he did not spend with her. Her strength was failing her. She concluded in a whisper, "That way I shall know that I have performed a good action. You will love me all the more." Then there was silence. She closed her eyes, looking paler still on the pillow. He had listened to her under the pretext of not wishing to tire her. At the end of a few minutes she reopened her eyes and murmured, "And money, too? Where will you get money if you quarrel? Labordette came yesterday about the bill. I'm in want of everything. I've not a thing left to put on." Then, closing her eyes again, she appeared as though dead. A shade of intense anguish overspread Muffat's face. In the blow that had come upon him, he had forgotten, ever since the night before, the monetary difficulties from which he no longer knew how to extricate himself. In spite of the most distinct promises, his note for 100,000 francs, already renewed once, had been put into circulation, and Labordette, affecting to be greatly vexed, made out it was all Francis's fault, and said that he would never again compromise himself in an affair with an uneducated man. It would have to be paid. The Count would never let his note be protested. Then, besides Nana's innumerable claims, there was a most wasteful expenditure going on in his own home. On the return from Les Fondettes, the Countess had suddenly developed a taste for luxury, an appetite for worldly enjoyments which were rapidly devouring their fortune. People were beginning to talk of her ruinous caprices, a complete change of her household, 500,000 francs frittered away in transforming the old house in the Rue Miromesnil, and extravagant costumes and large sums of money that had disappeared, melted or been given away perhaps, without her troubling herself to render the least account. Twice Muffat had ventured to make some observations, being desirous of knowing, but she had looked at him so peculiarly, smiling the while, that he did not dare to ask any questions for fear of receiving too plain an answer. If he accepted Dagonet as a son-in-law from Nana, it was especially with the idea of being able to reduce Estelle's dowry to 200,000 francs, and of making arrangements respecting the balance with the young man, who would be only too delighted at such an unexpectedly good marriage. However, during the last week, in view of the necessity of immediately finding the 100,000 francs for the bill, Muffat had only been able to think of one expedient from which he recoiled. It was to sell a magnificent estate called Les Bordes, estimated at 500,000, and which the Countess had recently inherited from an uncle. Only he needed her assent, and she also, by her marriage contract, could not dispose of it without his. The night before he had made up his mind to ask his wife for her consent. But now his plans were all upset. He could never accept such a compromise, knowing what he did. This thought made the blow he had received all the harder. He understood what it was that Nana wished, for in the increasing constraint that prompted him to confide in her regarding everything, he had complained about the difficulty he was in, and had told her how anxious he was to get the Countess's consent. However, Nana did not appear to insist. She did not reopen her eyes. Seeing her so pale, he was frightened, and induced her to take a little ether. Then she sighed and questioned him, but without naming Dagonet. "When is the marriage coming off?" "The contract is to be signed on Tuesday, in 5 days from now," he replied. Then, with her eyes still closed, as though she was speaking in the night of her thoughts, she added, "Well, ducky, think what you had better do. For myself, I want everyone to be pleased." He pacified her by taking her hand. Yes, he would think about it. The main thing was for her to rest. And his indignation left him. That sick room, so warm and so still, smelling strongly of ether, had ended by lulling him in a blessed peacefulness. All his manliness, aroused by the injury, had disappeared on his contact with the warmth of that bed, beside that suffering woman whom he nursed under the excitement of his fever, and with the recollection of their voluptuous pleasures. He leant over her. He held her in his embrace. Though her face did not move, on her lips hovered the keen smile of victory. At that moment, Dr. Boutarel entered the room. "Well, and how is this dear child?" said he familiarly to Muffat, whom he treated as the husband. "The deuce! She's been talking." But Doctor was a handsome man, still young, and had a superb connection in the world of gallantry. Very gay, always laughing like a comrade with the ladies, but never departing from his professional position, he charged monstrous fees, which invariably had to be paid with great punctuality. He would trouble himself to call for the least thing. Nana often sent for him 2 or 3 times a week, always trembling at the thought of death, and anxiously telling him of every little ache and pain, which he cured whilst amusing her with gossip and funny stories. All the women adored him. But this time the complaint was serious. Muffat withdrew, deeply affected. He had no other feeling but that of compassion at seeing his poor Nana so weak. As he was leaving the room, she beckoned him back, and offered her forehead to be kissed. Then, in a low voice, with a playfully menacing air, she whispered, "You know what I told you you might do. Make it up with your wife, or I shall be angry." Countess Sabine had wished her daughter's marriage contract to be signed on a Tuesday, to inaugurate the restoration of her town-house, the paintings of which were scarcely dry, by a grand party. 500 invitations had been sent out, a few in all the different sets. On the morning itself, the upholsterers were still putting up some of the hangings, and at the time of lighting the chandeliers, towards 9 o'clock, the architect, accompanied by the Countess, who was enraptured, was giving his final instructions. It was one of those charming spring parties. The warm June evening had enabled the 2 doors of a drawing-room to be thrown wide open, and the ball to be carried even on the gravel paths of the garden. When the first guests arrived, they were fairly dazzled, as the Count and Countess greeted them at the door. It was difficult to recall the room of bygone days in which lingered the icy recollection of old Countess Muffat, that antique apartment full of devout severity, with its solid mahogany furniture of the style of the Empire, its yellow velvet hangings, its greenish ceiling saturated with dampness. Now, in the entrance vestibule, mosaics set off with gold shone beneath the tall candelabra, whilst the marble staircase unrolled its finely chiselled balustrade. Then the drawing-room was resplendent with Genoa velvet hangings, and a ceiling embellished with a vast painting by Boucher, which the architect had purchased for 100,000 francs at the sale of the chateau of Dampierre. The crystal chandeliers and candelabra illuminated a profusion of mirrors and costly furniture. One could have said that Sabine's easy-chair, that solitary seat covered with crimson silk, and the softness of which used to seem so much out of place, had extended and multiplied until it filled the entire house with a voluptuous indolence, a keen enjoyment which burned with all the intensity of latent fires. The dancing had commenced. The orchestra, placed in the garden in front of one of the open windows, was playing a waltz, the sprightly rhythm of which arrived softened and subdued from the open air. And the garden spread itself out in the transparent shadow, lighted up by Venetian lanterns, with a purple tent for refreshments erected at the edge of a lawn. This waltz, the saucy waltz of the blonde Venus, which resembled the laugh raised by some over-free piece of buffoonery, penetrated the old house with a sonorous swell, warming the walls with its tremor. It seemed like some breath of the flesh coming from the street, sweeping before it the whole of a defunct age in the haughty abode, carrying away the past of the Muffats, centuries of honor and of faith slumbering beneath the ceilings. Close to the fireplace, however, the old friends of the Count's mother had taken refuge in their accustomed seats, feeling dazed and out of their element. They formed a little group in the midst of the gradually increasing crowd. Madame de Joncois, no longer recognizing the place, had at first gone into the dining-room. Madame Chantereau looked with amazement at the garden, which seemed to her immense. Soon all sorts of bitter reflections were whispered in this corner. "I say," murmured Madame Chantereau, Supposing the old countess were only to return. Just fancy her look on beholding all these people and all this gold and this hubbub. It is scandalous." "Sabine is mad," replied Madame de Joncois. "Did you notice her at the door? Look, you can see her from here. She has all her diamonds on." They stood up for a moment to look at the Count and Countess in the distance. Sabine, in a white costume trimmed with some magnificent English lace, was triumphant with beauty, young, lively, and with a touch of intoxication in her continual smile. Muffat, beside her, looking aged and rather pale, smiled also in his calm, dignified manner. "And to think that he was the master," resumed Madame Chantereau, "that not the smallest seat would have been admitted here without his permission. Ah, well, she has changed all that. He obeys her now. Do you recollect the time when she would not alter a thing in the drawing-room? The whole house is altered now." But they ceased talking as Madame de Chazelles entered, followed by a troop of young men, all of them enraptured, and giving vent to their admiration in faint exclamations. "Oh, delicious! Exquisite! So full of taste!" And she called back to them, "It's just as I said. There's nothing like these old buildings when one knows how to arrange them. They look so grand. Is it not quite worthy of Louis XIV's time? Now, at least, she can receive." This ends Chapter 12, Part 1 of Nana. Chapter 12, Part 2 of Nana by Émile Zola. Translated by Burton Raskell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 12, Part 2 of Nana. The two old ladies had sat down again, and lowering their voices, they talked of the marriage which surprised many people. Estelle had just passed in a pink silk dress, still flat and thin, with her expressionless virgin face. She had accepted Dagonet quietly. She showed neither joy nor sadness, but remained as cold and pale as on those winter nights when she used to put the logs of wood on the fire. All this entertainment given for her, these illuminations, these flowers, this music, left her cold. "An adventurer," Madame de Joncois was saying. "I have never seen him." "Take care, here he comes," murmured Madame Chantereau. Dagonet, who had caught sight of Madame Rougon with her sons, had hastened to offer her his arm, and he laughed. He showed her an amount of affectionate attention, as though she had had something to do with his stroke of fortune. "Thank you," said she, seating herself by the fireplace. "This is my old corner." "Do you know him?" asked Madame de Joncois, when Dagonet had gone off. "Certainly. He's a charming young man. Georges likes him immensely. Oh, he comes of a most honorable family." And the good lady defended him against a covert hostility which she felt existed. His father, who was greatly esteemed by Louis-Philippe, had occupied a prefect's post until his death. The young man had perhaps been rather dissipated. It was said that he was ruined. At any rate, one of his uncles, a rich landed proprietor, was going to bequeath his fortune to him. But the other ladies shook their heads, whilst Madame Rougon, feeling rather embarrassed, kept laying great stress on the honorable position of the family. She felt very tired and complained of her legs. For a month past she'd been stopping at her house in the Rue Richelieu for a host of business matters, so she said. A shade of sadness veiled her maternal smile. "All the same," concluded Madame Chantereau, "Estelle might have made a far better match." There was a flourish of music. It was the commencement of a quadrille. The crowd moved to the sides of the room to leave an open space. Light dresses passed, mixed with dark dress suits, whilst the blaze of light shone on the sea of heads, illuminating the sparkling jewels, the waving white plumes, and the bloom of lilac and roses. It was already very warm. A penetrating perfume rose from the light tuiles, the satins, and the silks, among which the bare shoulders paled beneath the lively notes of the orchestra. Through the open doors one could see rows of women seated in the adjacent rooms, with a discreet brightness in their smile, a sparkle in their eyes, a pout on their lips, gently fanning themselves. And guests still continued to arrive. A footman announced their names, whilst amidst the various groups gentlemen slowly tried to find places for the ladies on their arms, standing on tiptoe in search of a vacant chair. But the house was filling. The skirts were packing closer together with a slight noise. There were places where a mass of lace, bows, and flounces barred the way, the wearers politely resigned, retaining all their grace, accustomed as they were to such brilliant crushes. However, out in the garden, in the roseate light of the Venetian lanterns, couples were wandering about, having escaped from the stifling atmosphere of the great drawing-room. The shadows of dresses passed over the lawn, as though keeping time to the music of the quadrille, which sounded softer in the distance behind the trees. Steiner, who was there, had just come across Foucarmont and Lafaloise partaking of champagne in the refreshment tent. "It's awfully swell," Lafaloise was saying, while examining the purple tent and the gilded lances which supported it. "One could almost think oneself at the gingerbread fair. Yes, that's it, the gingerbread fair." He now affected to continually poke fun at everything, posing as a young man who was sick of the world, and who could find nothing worthy of being looked at in a serious light. "Wouldn't poor Vandouvre be surprised if he returned here?" murmured Foucarmont. "Don't you recollect when he used to be bored to death over there opposite the fireplace? By Jove, no one laughed then." "Vandouvre? Don't mention him. He's extinguished," resumed Lafaloise disdainfully. "He was greatly mistaken if he thought he was going to astonish us with his roasting. Not a soul talks of it now. He's out of it, done for, scratched. Vandouvre, talk of another." Then, as Steiner shook hands with them, he continued, "You know, Nana's just arrived. Oh, such an entry, my boy, something prodigious. First of all, she embraced the Countess. Then, when the children drew near, she blessed them, saying to Dagonet, 'Listen, Paul, if you deceive her, you'll have me after you.' What? Didn't you see it? Oh, she was grand, such a success." The other two listened to him with their mouths open. At length they burst out laughing. He, delighted, thought himself very wonderful. "Eh? You believed it all? Well, why not? It's Nana who arranged the marriage. Besides, she's one of the family." But two Hougons passed just then, and Philippe made him desist. Then, as men, they talked of the marriage. Georges became very incensed with Lafaloise, who related the story of it. Nana had indeed saddled Muffat with one of her former lovers for a son-in-law, only it was untrue that she had had Dagonet to see her the night before. Foucarmont incredulously shrugged his shoulders. Did anyone ever know when Nana had to see her of a night? But Georges angrily replied with a "Sir, I know," which made them all laugh. Anyhow, as Steiner said, it was a very peculiar state of affairs. Little by little the refreshment tent was becoming crowded. They moved away from the bar without separating. Lafaloise stared impudently at the women, as though he thought himself at Mabille. At the end of a path they were greatly surprised on beholding Monsieur Verneau engaged in a long conversation with Dagonet, and some very poor jokes amused them immensely. He was confessing him. He was giving him some advice for the first night. Then they went and stood in front of one of the open doors of a drawing-room, where some couples dancing a polka were steering their way amidst the men who remained standing. The candles were guttering from the breeze coming from outside. When a couple passed, keeping time to the music, it refreshed the heated atmosphere like a gentle puff of wind. "By Jove, they can't be very cold in there," murmured Lafaloise. Their eyes blinked on coming from out of the mysterious shadows of the garden, and they drew each other's attention to the Marquis de Chouart, who, standing all alone, and stretched to the full height of his tall figure, overlooked the bare shoulders around him. His pale face appeared very severe, and bore an expression of haughty dignity beneath his crown of scanty white locks. Scandalized by Count Muffat's conduct, he had publicly broken off all connection with him, and affected not to visit at the house. If he had consented to appear on this occasion, it was on account of the earnest entreaties of his granddaughter, whose marriage, however, he disapproved of in indignant language against the disorganization of the upper classes by the shameful compromises of modern debauchery. "Ah, the end is at hand," Madame de Joncois, beside the fireplace, was whispering to Madame Chantereau. "That hussy has so bewitched the unhappy fellow. We who used to know him, so staunch a believer, so noble." "It appears that he's ruining himself," continued Madame Chantereau. "My husband has had a note of his. He lives now altogether in that mansion of the Avenue de Villiers. All Paris is talking about him. Really, I cannot excuse Sabine either, though we must admit that he gives her a great many causes for complaint. And, well, if she also throws the money out of the window—" "She does not only throw money," interrupted the other. "Well, as they are both at work, they will reach the end all the sooner. A regular drowning in the mire, my dear." But a gentle voice interrupted them. It was Monsieur Veynaud. He had come and seated himself behind them, as though desirous of being out of the way, and leaning towards them, he murmured, "Why despair? God manifests himself when all seems lost." He was peacefully assisting at the downfall of that house which once upon a time he had governed. Ever since his sojourn at Les Fondettes, he had quietly allowed the undermining to go on, fully aware of how powerless he was to cope with it. He had accepted everything: the Count's mad infatuation for Nana, Fauchery's close attendance on the Countess, even Dagonet's marriage with Estelle. What mattered those things? And he showed himself more supple, more mysterious, entertaining the idea of influencing the young couple the same as he had the now disunited one, knowing that great disorders lead to great devotions. Providence would have its hour. "Our friend," continued he in a low voice, "is still animated with the best religious sentiments. He has given me the sweetest proofs." "Well, then," said Madame de Joncois, "he should first of all make it up with his wife." "No doubt. Just now I happen to have the hope that their reconciliation will not be long in coming about." Then the two old ladies questioned him, but he became very humble again. They must let heaven accomplish it in its own way. His sole desire in bringing the Count and Countess closer together was to avoid a public scandal. Religion tolerated many failings when appearances were kept up. "At any rate," resumed Madame de Joncois, "you ought to have prevented this marriage with this adventurer." "You are mistaken. Monsieur Dagonet is a very worthy young man. I am acquainted with his ideas. He wishes to cause his youthful errors to be forgotten. Estelle will bring him into the right path, you may be sure." "Oh, Estelle!" disdainfully murmured Madame Chantereau. "I think the dear child is quite without any will whatever. She is altogether so insignificant." This expression of opinion caused Monsieur Veynaud to smile. However, he did not explain himself respecting the young bride. Closing his eyes, as though to withdraw from the conversation, he again hid himself in his corner behind the skirts. Madame Rougon, in the midst of her absent-minded weariness, had overheard a few words. She joined in, and as she addressed herself to the Marquise de Chouart, who had come to greet her, thus concluded with her tolerating air: "You ladies are too severe. Existence is already so bad for everyone. Eh, my friend? We ought to forgive a great deal in others when we wish to be ourselves worthy of pardon." The Marquise remained embarrassed for a few moments, fearing an allusion to himself. But the good lady had so sad a smile that he soon regained his composure and said, "No, certain faults deserve no pardon. It is by such complaisances that society totters on its foundations." The ball had become more animated than ever. Another quadrille gave a kind of gentle swing to the floor of the drawing-room, as though the old house had staggered beneath the commotion of the merrymaking. Now and again, in the mixed paleness of the faces, there stood out a woman's countenance, carried away by the dance, with sparkling eyes and parted lips, and the full light of a chandelier shining on her white skin. Madame de Joncourt declared that the Count and Countess must have been out of their senses. It was madness to squeeze 500 people into a room that could scarcely hold 200. Why not have the contract signed on the Place du Carrousel at once? It was the result of new manners, Madame Chantereau said. In her younger days, such solemnities took place in the bosom of one's family. Now one must have a mob, the whole street being freely allowed to enter. Unless one had such a crush, the entertainment would be considered quiet and uneventful. One advertised one's luxury, one introduced into one's abode the very scum of Paris, and there was nothing more natural if such promiscuousness ended by corrupting the home. The two ladies complained that they did not know more than 50 of the persons present. How was it so? Young girls in low-necked dresses displayed their bare shoulders. A woman wore a golden dagger stuck in her chignon, whilst the body of her dress, embroidered with jet-black beads, looked like a coat of mail. Another was being smilingly followed about, her skirts so tight-fitting that they gave her a most singular appearance. All the luxury of the clothes of the winter season was there, the world of pleasure with its tolerations, all that which the mistress of a house picks from her acquaintances of a day, a society where great names and great infamies elbowed each other in the same appetite for pleasure. The heat was increasing. The quadrille unrolled the cadenced symmetry of its figures amidst the overcrowded rooms. "The Countess is stunning," resumed La Falloise at the garden door. "She looks 10 years younger than her daughter. By the way, Foucarmont, you can give us some information. Vandover used to bet that she had no thighs worth speaking of." This affectation of cynicism bored the other gentleman. Foucarmont contented himself with replying, "Consult your cousin, my boy. He's just coming this way." "Yes, that's an idea," cried La Falloise. "I bet 10 louis that her thighs are good." Fauchery was indeed just arriving. As an intimate friend of the house, he had passed through the dining-room so as to avoid the crush at the doors. Taken up again by Rose at the beginning of the winter, he now divided himself between the singer and the Countess, feeling very wearied, not knowing how to break off with one of the two. Sabine flattered his vanity, but Rose amused him more. The latter, too, entertained a genuine affection for him, a tenderness of really conjugal fidelity, which grieved Mignon immensely. "Listen, we want some information," said La Falloise, squeezing his cousin's arm. "You see that lady in white silk?" Ever since his inheritance had given him an insolent assurance, he affected to poke fun at Fauchery, having an old spite to gratify, wishing to be revenged for the banterings of a time when he first arrived from the country. "Yes, that lady who has a lot of lace about her." The journalist stood on tiptoe, not yet understanding. "The Countess?" he ended by saying. "Just so, my boy. I've bet 10 louis. Are her thighs good?" And he burst out laughing, delighted at having succeeded in taking down a peg, that fellow who had once amazed him so much when he asked him if the Countess had a lover. But Fauchery, without showing the least surprise, looked him straight in the face. "You idiot," said he at last, shrugging his shoulders. Then he shook hands with the other gentleman, whilst La Falloise, quite put out of countenance, was no longer very sure of having said something funny. They stood conversing together. Ever since the races, the banker and Foucarmont had joined the set at the Avenue de Villiers. Nana was much better. The Count called every evening to see how she was progressing. However, Fauchery, who merely listened, seemed preoccupied. That morning, during a quarrel, Rose had deliberately told him that she had sent the letter. Yes, he might go and call on his grand lady. He would be well received. After hesitating for a long time, he had courageously made up his mind to come. but Lafaloise's stupid joke had upset him, in spite of his apparent serenity. "What's the matter with you?" asked Philippe. "You don't seem well." "I? Oh, I'm all right. I've been working. That's why I'm so late." Then, coolly, with one of those unknown heroisms which unravel the common tragedies of life, he added, "With all that, I've not paid my respects to our hosts. One must be polite." He even dared to joke, and turning to Lafaloise said, "Am I not right, idiot?" And he made a passage for himself through the crowd. The footman was no longer bawling out the names. The Count and Countess, however, were still near the door, conversing with some ladies who just entered. At length he reached the spot where they stood, whilst the gentleman he had just left on the steps leading into the garden stood up on tiptoe to have a good view of the scene. Nana must have been gossiping. "The Count does not see him," murmured Georges. "Attention! He's turning round. There, now they're at it." The orchestra was again playing the waltz of the Blonde Venus. First of all, Fauchery bowed to the Countess, who continued to smile, serenely delighted. Then he stood for a moment immovable, calmly waiting, behind the Count's back. The Count that night maintained his haughty gravity, the official bearing of a high dignitary. When at length he lowered his eyes towards the journalist, he exaggerated still more his majestic attitude. For some seconds the two men looked at each other, and it was Fauchery who first held out his hand. Muffat clasped it. Their hands were locked, one in the other. Countess Sabine smiled in front of them, her eyes cast on the ground, whilst the waltz continued to unroll its saucy rhythm. "But it's going splendidly," said Steiner. "Are their hands glued together?" asked Foucarmont, amazed at the length of time they remained clasped. An invincible recollection brought a rosy blush to Fauchery's pale cheeks. He again beheld the property room, with its greenish light and its odd assortment of things smothered with dust. And Muffat was there, holding the egg cup and taking advantage of his suspicions. Now Muffat no longer had any doubts. It was a last shred of dignity collapsing. Fauchery, relieved of his fright, seeing the Countess's evident gaiety, was seized with a desire to laugh. It seemed to him so comic. "Ah, this time it is indeed she!" exclaimed Lafaloise, who stuck to a joke when once he thought it a good one. "There's Nana over there. Look, she's entering the room." "Shut up, you idiot," murmured Philippe. "I tell you it's she. They're playing her waltz. She comes, and besides, she's had a share in the reconciliation. Dash it all! What, don't you see her? She's pressing them all to her heart. My male cousin, my female cousin, and her spouse. And calling them her little ducky darlings. They always upset me, these family scenes." Estelle had drawn near. Fauchery complimented her, whilst she, looking very stiff in her pink dress, watched him with the surprised air of a silent child, glancing also at her father and mother. Daguenet, too, heartily shook hands with the journalist. They formed a smiling group, and Monsieur Vineau glided behind, looking tenderly on them, enveloping them all with his devout meekness, happy at beholding these last affections which were preparing the ways of Providence. But the waltz still continued its voluptuous whirl. It was an increase of the wave of pleasure, overtaking the old mansion like a rising tide. The orchestra swelled the trills of its little flutes, the rapturous sighs of its violins. Beneath the Genoa velvet hangings, the gildings, and the paintings, the chandeliers gave out a lifelike warmth, a light as bright as sunshine, whilst the crowd of guests, reflected in the mirrors, seemed to increase with the louder murmur of the voices. Around the drawing-room, the couples which passed with arms encircling waists, amidst the smiles of seated women, accentuated the shaking of the flooring. In the garden, the ember-like glimmer of the Venetian lanterns lighted up the dark shadows of the promenaders, seeking a breath of air along the walks, as though with the distant reflection of a fire. And this trembling of the walls, this ruddy cloud, was like the blazing of the end in which the ancient family honour fell to pieces, burning at the four corners of the home. but timid gaieties, then scarcely beginning, which one April evening Fauchery had heard ring with the sound of breaking glass, had little by little become emboldened, maddened, to burst forth into the resplendency of that entertainment. Now the crack increased. It attacked the house and gave warning of its approaching destruction. Amongst the drunkards of the slums, it is by the blackest misery, the cupboard without bread, the craving for alcohol eating up the last sticks, that corrupted families reach their end. Here, over the downfall of these riches, heaped together and set fire to at one fell swoop, the waltz sounded the knell of an ancient race, whilst Nana, invisible but hovering above the ball with her supple limbs, polluted all those people, penetrating them with the ferment of her odor floating in the warm air above the wings of the saucy rhythm of the music. It was on the night of the wedding at the church that Count Muffat appeared in his wife's bedroom, which he had not entered for 2 years past. The Countess, greatly surprised, drew back at first, but she preserved her smile, that smile of intoxication which now never left her. He, very much embarrassed, could only stutter a few words. Then she gave him a little lecture, but neither the one nor the other ventured on a complete explanation. It was religion that required this mutual forgiveness, and it was tacitly agreed between them that they should retain their liberty. Before going to bed, as the Countess still seemed to hesitate, they discussed business matters. He, the first, talked of selling les Bordes. She at once consented. They both had great want of money. They would share the proceeds. That completed the reconciliation. Muffat experienced a real relief in spite of his remorse. That day, too, as Nana was dozing, towards 2 o'clock, Zoe ventured to knock at the door of her bedroom. The curtains were drawn. A warm breeze entered by one of the windows, in the still freshness of the subdued light. The young woman got up a little now, though still rather weak. She opened her eyes and asked, "Who is it?" Zoe was about to reply, but Dagonet, forcing his way in, announced himself. On hearing him, she leant upon the pillow, and, sending the maid away, said, "What, it's you! On your wedding day! Whatever is the matter?" He, not seeing clearly, remained standing in the middle of the room. However, he soon got used to the obscurity, and advanced forward in his dress clothes, with a white tie and gloves, and he kept saying, "Well, yes, it's I. Don't you recollect?" No, she remembered nothing, so he had to crudely refresh her memory in his jocular way. "Why, your commission. I've brought you the hansel of my innocence." Then, as he was close to the bed, she seized hold of him with her bare arms, shaking with laughter and almost weeping, for she thought it so nice of him. "Ah, my Mimi, how funny he is! He's not forgotten it, and I who no longer remembered. So you've given them the slip. You've just come from the church. It's true, you have an odor of incense about you. But kiss me. Oh, more than that, my Mimi. It will perhaps be for the last time." Their tender laugh expired in the darkened room, about which there still hung a vague smell of ether. The close warmth swelled the window curtains. Children's voices sounded in the avenue. Then they made merry, though pressed for time. Dagonet was to leave with his wife directly after the wedding breakfast. This ends Chapter 12, Part 2 of Nana. Chapter 13, Part 1 of Nana, by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rasco. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 13, Part 1 of Nana. Towards the end of September, Count Muffat, who was to dine at Nana's that evening, came at dusk to inform her of a sudden order he had received to be at the Tuileries. The house was not yet lighted up. The servants were laughing very loudly in the kitchen. He slowly ascended the staircase. the windows of which shone in the prevailing warm shadow. Upstairs the parlor door made no noise as he opened it. A rosy daylight was fading from the ceiling of the room. The crimson hangings, the capacious sofas, the lacquer furniture, all that medley of embroidered stuffs, of bronzes, and of china, was already disappearing beneath a slowly deepening veil of gloom, which penetrated the corners, hiding alike the brilliancy of the ivory and the glitter of the gold. And there, in this obscurity, by the aid alone of the light color of her dress, he beheld Nana reclining in George's arms. All denial on their part was impossible. He uttered a suppressed cry and stood as one lost. Nana sprang to her feet and pushed him into the bedroom, to give the youngster time to get off. "Come in here," she murmured, scarcely knowing what she said. "I will explain." She was exasperated at being caught like that. She had never before given way in such a manner at home, in that parlor with the doors unfastened. A number of things had tended to bring it about. A quarrel with Georges, who was madly jealous of Philippe. He sobbed so bitterly on her neck that she could not resist, scarcely knowing how to calm him, and pitying him in her heart. And on the one occasion when she was so foolish as to forget herself thus, with a youngster who could not even bring her bunches of violets now, as his mother guarded him so strictly, the Count must needs come and catch them. Really, she had no luck. That was all one got by being a good-natured girl. However, the obscurity in the bedroom where she had pushed the Count was complete. Then, feeling her way, she went and rang furiously for a lamp. After all, it was that Julien's fault. If there had been a light in the parlor, nothing of all this would have happened. That stupid darkness which had come on had played the deuce with her heart. "I beg of you, ducky, be reasonable," said she, when Zoe brought a light. The Count, sitting down, his hands on his knees, looked on the ground, overcome by what he had just seen. He could not utter a word of anger. He trembled as though seized with a horror which froze him. This silent anguish deeply affected the young woman. She tried to console him. "Well, yes, I was wrong. It was very naughty of me. You see, I'm sorry for my fault. I'm very grieved as it annoys you so much. Come now, you too be nice and forgive me." She had sat down at his feet and was seeking his glance with a look of submissive tenderness to see if he was very angry with her. Then, as, heaving a deep sigh, he recovered himself, she became more wheedling. The Count yielded to her entreaties. He merely insisted on George being sent away. But all illusion was gone. He could no longer believe in Nana's sworn fidelity. On the morrow Nana would deceive him again, and he remained in the torment of possessing her simply through cowardice, through his fright at the idea of living without her. This was the epoch of her existence when Nana brightened Paris with an increase of splendor. She became more imposing still on the horizon of vice. She domineered over the city with the insolent display of her luxury, with her contempt for money, which caused her to publicly melt away fortunes. In her mansion there was like the glare of a furnace. Her continual desires fed it. The least breath from her lips would change the gold into fine ashes, which the wind swept away at every hour. Never before had such a mania for expense been seen. The house seemed built over an abyss into which men with their wealth, their bodies, even their names were precipitated, without leaving the trace of a little dust behind. This girl, with the tastes of a parrot, nibbling radishes and burnt almonds, playing with her meat, had bills to the extent of 5,000 francs a month for her table. In the servants' hall there was unbridled waste, a ferocious leakage, which emptied the casks of wine and ran up bills increased by 3 or 4 hands through which they passed. Victorine and Francois reigned supreme in the kitchen, where they invited their friends, not to speak of a host of cousins whom they fed at their own homes with cold joints and meat soups. Julien exacted commissions from all the tradespeople. A glazier did not put in a 30-sou pane of glass, but the butler had 20 added on for himself. Charles devoured the oats for the horses, ordering double the necessary supply, selling by a back door what came in by the front one, whilst in the midst of this universal pillage, of this sack of a town taken by assault, Zoe, by great art, succeeded in saving appearances, covering the thefts of all the others the better to hide and secure her own. But what was wasted was still worse. The food of the previous day thrown in the gutter, an encumbrance of victuals at which the servants turned up their noses, the glasses all sticky with sugar, glass jets blazing away, turned on recklessly, sufficient to blow up the place, and negligences and spitefulness and accidents, all that can hasten ruin in an establishment devoured by so many mouths. Then, upstairs in Madame's rooms, the downfall was even greater still. Dresses costing 10,000 francs, worn only twice and sold by Zoe. Jewels which disappeared as though they had crumbled away at the bottoms of the drawers. Idiotic purchases, novelties of the day, forgotten in a corner on the morrow and swept into the street. She could never see anything costing a great deal without desiring it. She thus created around her a continual devastation of flowers and precious knickknacks, being all the more delighted in proportion to the price paid for them. Nothing remained perfect in her hands. She broke everything, or it faded or became soiled between her little white fingers. A strewing of nameless remnants, of crumpled rags, of muddy tatters followed in her wake. Then the heavy settlements burst out in the midst of this waste of pocket money. 20,000 francs owing to the milliner, 30,000 to the linen draper, 12,000 to the bootmaker. Her stable had swallowed 50,000. In 6 months her dressmakers had run up to 100,000 francs. Without her having added to her household, which Labordette had estimated would cost an average 400,000 francs yearly, she reached that year 1,000,000, amazed herself at the sum, and quite incapable of saying where all the money could possibly have gone to. Men piled up one upon the other. Gold emptied out in barrowfuls were unable to fill that chasm which was forever opening deeper and deeper beneath the foundations of her house in the disruption of her luxury. Nana, however, still nursed a last caprice. Agitated once more with the idea of redecorating her bedroom, she thought she had at last found something to suit her fancy. A room hung in tea-rose velvet, padded and reached up to the ceiling, in the shape of a tent, ornamented with little silver buttons and with gold lace and cords. It seemed to her that this would look both rich and tender, a superb background to her fair skin. But the room, however, was merely to serve as a framework to the bed, a prodigy of dazzling brightness. Nana dreamed of a bed such as was never seen before, a throne, an altar to which all Paris would come to adore her sovereign nudity. It was to be entirely of gold and silver, like an immense jewel, golden roses scattered over a silver network. At the head, a band of cupids amongst the flowers would be glancing down with laughter on their faces, watching the voluptuous pleasures in the shadow of the curtains. She had consulted Labordette, who had brought 2 goldsmiths to see her. They were already preparing the drawings. The bed was to cost 50,000 francs, and Muffat was to present her with it as a New Year gift. What surprised the young woman was that in this ever-flowing river of gold she was constantly without money. Some days she scarcely knew what to do for want of the most ridiculous sums, of a few louis. She had to borrow of Zoe, or else raise funds any way she could. But before resigning herself to extreme measures, she would sound her friends, getting out of the men whatever they had about them, even sous, in a jocular sort of way. For 3 months past she had especially been emptying Philippe's pockets in this manner. He now never called, whenever there was a crisis at hand, without leaving his purse behind him on leaving. Soon, becoming bolder, Nana had begun to ask him for loans. 200 francs, 300 francs, never more, for bills becoming due, or debts that could not remain longer unpaid. And Philippe, who in July had been made a captain and paymaster of his regiment, would bring the money on the morrow with the excuse that he was not rich, for good Madame Rougon now treated her sons with singular harshness. At the end of 3 months these little loans, often repeated, amounted to some 10,000 francs. The captain still laughed in his hearty, sonorous way. Yet he was growing thin, appearing absent-minded at times, with a look of suffering on his face. But a glance from Nana transfigured him in a sort of sensual ecstasy. She was very playful with him, intoxicating him with kisses behind doors, bewitching him with sudden abandonments of herself, which tied him to her petticoats the whole time he was off duty. One night, Nana having mentioned that her name was also Thérèse, and that her saint's day was on the 15th October, the gentlemen all sent her presents. Captain Philippe brought his, an old Saxon china comfit-box mounted with gold. He found her alone in her dressing-room, having just come out of her bath, clothed only in a loose scarlet and white flannel dressing-gown, and very busy examining the presents spread out on a table. She had already broken a scent bottle in rock crystal in trying to take the stopper out. "Oh, you are too nice," said she. "Whatever is it? Show me. What a child you are to spend your money in things like this." She scolded him because he was not rich, although really very pleased to see him spend all he had on her, the only proof of love which ever touched her. However, she handled the comfit-box, wishing to see how it was made, opening and shutting it. "Take care," he murmured, "it's not very strong." But she shrugged her shoulders. Did he think she had the hands of a railway porter? And suddenly the hinge remained between her fingers, whilst the lid fell to the ground and broke. She stood lost in amazement, with her eyes fixed on the pieces. "Oh, it's broken," said she. Then she began to laugh. The pieces on the floor looked funny to her. It was a nervous gaiety. She had the stupid and cruel laugh of a child who finds amusement in destruction. Philippe was seized for a moment with a feeling of indignation. The wretched woman did not know what agony that trifle had cost him. When she saw him looking so upset, she endeavored to restrain herself. "Anyhow, it wasn't my fault. It was cracked. Those old things never keep together. It was the lid. Did you see the stupid way in which it fell off?" And she burst out laughing again. But as the young man's eyes filled with tears, in spite of his efforts to restrain them, she lovingly threw her arms round his neck. "How silly you are! I love you all the same. If nothing was ever broken, the dealers would never sell anything. It's all made to be broken. Look at this fan. It isn't even stuck together." She seized hold of a fan and roughly pulled it open. The silk tore in two. That seemed to excite her. To show that she did not care anything for the other presents, as she had spoiled his, she regaled herself with a general massacre, knocking the different things about, proving, as she destroyed them all, there was not one of them that was solid. A glimmer lighted up her vacant eyes, a slight curl of her lips displayed her white teeth. Then, when all things were in pieces, she struck the table with her open hands, looking very red and laughing louder than ever, and stammered forth in a childish voice, "All gone! No more! No more!" Then Philippe, yielding to the intoxication, cheered up and, pressing against her, kissed her on the neck and bosom. She abandoned herself to him, clinging to his shoulders, feeling so happy that she could not recollect having ever enjoyed herself so much before. And without leaving go of him, she caressingly said, "I say, darling, you might manage to bring me 10 louis tomorrow. It's an awful nuisance, a baker's bill which is worrying me." He became very pale. Then, kissing her for a last time on the forehead, he merely said, "I will do my best." A pause ensued. She was dressing herself. He was pressing his face against the window pane. At the end of a minute he returned to where she stood and said slowly, "Nana, you ought to marry me." The idea seemed so ludicrous to the young woman that she could not finish fastening her petticoats. "But, my poor fellow, you must be ill. Is it because I've asked you for 10 louis that you offer me your hand? Never. I love you too much for that. What a stupid idea to get into your head." And as Zoe entered the room to put Madame's boots on, they dropped the subject. The maid had at once caught sight of the remnants of the presents scattered over the table. She asked if they were to be put anywhere, and Madame having said that they could be thrown away, she gathered them up in her apron. Down in the kitchen the servants quarrelled together as they shared Madame's leavings. That day Georges, in spite of having been forbidden by Nana to do so, had sneaked into the house. Francois had plainly enough seen him come in, but now the servants merely laughed among themselves over their mistress's embarrassments. He'd crept into the parlour, where the sound of his brother's voice arrested his advance, and with his ear at the keyhole he had heard all that had taken place, the kisses, the offer of marriage. A feeling of horror froze him. He went off, idiotic and with a sensation of emptiness in his head. It was only when he reached the Rue Richelieu, in his room over his mother's, that his heart found relief in furious sobs. This time doubt was impossible. An abominable vision kept appearing before his eyes. Nana in Philippe's arms, and it seemed to him an incest. When he thought himself calmed, memory returned, and in a fresh fit of jealous rage he threw himself on his bed, biting the sheets and uttering horrible oaths, which increased his passion. The rest of the day passed thus. He complained of a headache so as to be able to remain in his room, but the night was more terrible still. A murderous fever shook his frame in a continuous nightmare. If his brother had lived in the house, he would have gone and stabbed him with a knife. When day returned, he tried to reason with himself. It was he who ought to die. He would throw himself from the window as an omnibus passed. However, towards 10 o'clock he went out. He wandered about Paris, rambled over the bridges, and then at last felt an invincible longing to see Nana. Perhaps with a word she would save him. And 3 o'clock was striking as he entered the house in the Avenue de Villiers. Toward midday some shocking news had quite overwhelmed Madame Rougon. Philippe had been in prison since the previous evening, accused of having stolen 12,000 francs from the regimental chest. For 3 months past he'd been embezzling small sums, hoping to replace them, and hiding the deficit by means of false accounts. And this fraud had succeeded, thanks to the negligence of the managing council. The old lady, crushed by her child's crime, uttered at first a cry of rage against Nana. She knew of Philippe's intimacy with the young woman. Her sadness came from this misfortune, which was the cause of her remaining in Paris, through the fear of some catastrophe. But never had she dreaded such shame, and now she reproached herself for having refused him money, as though she'd been an accomplice. Having sunk into an armchair, her legs, so to say, paralyzed, she felt herself useless, incapable of doing anything, only fit to die. But the sudden thought of Georges consoled her. Georges was left her. He might do something, perhaps save them both. Then, without asking help from anyone, desirous of hiding all this amongst themselves, she dragged herself along and ascended the stairs, fortified by the thought that she still had one love remaining. But the room above was empty. The doorkeeper told her that Monsieur Georges had gone out early. The signs of a second misfortune hovered about the room. The bed, with its torn and crumpled sheets, told an unmistakable tale of anguish. A chair knocked over on the ground amongst some clothes seemed to forebode death. Georges was probably at that woman's, and Madame Rougon, with dry eyes and a firm step, descended the staircase. She wanted her sons. She was going to demand them. Ever since the morning, Nana had had nothing but worry. First of all, there was that baker, who as early as 9 o'clock had called with his bill, a mere nothing, 133 francs worth of bread, which she'd been unable to settle for in the midst of her regal style of living. He'd called 20 times, exasperated at having lost the custom on the day he had declined to give further credit, and the servants espoused his cause. Francois said that Madame would never pay him if he did not make a great fuss. Charles spoke of going upstairs to get an old bill for straw settled, whilst Victorine advised them to wait till some gentleman called, and to get the money by going to the drawing-room when he was there. The servants' hall was deeply interested. All the tradespeople were kept informed of what was going on. There were gossipings of 3 and 4 hours' duration. Madame was disrobed, pulled to pieces, talked about, with the rancour of idle menials bursting with good living. Julien, the butler, alone pretended to take Madame's part. She was, all the same, a fine woman, and when the others accused him of having enjoyed some of her favours, he laughed in a foppish sort of way, which put the cook beside herself, for she would have liked to have been a man to spit on such women, they disgusted her so much. Francois had maliciously left the baker waiting in the hall, without informing Madame. As she came downstairs at lunch-time, she found herself face to face with him. She took his bill, and told him to call again about 3 o'clock. Then, muttering a number of filthy expressions, he went off, swearing to be punctual, and to pay himself some way or other. Nana made a very poor lunch, being upset by this scene. This time she would have to satisfy the man. On 10 different occasions at least she put the money for him on one side, but somehow or other it had always dribbled away. One day for flowers, or another day for a subscription for an old gendarme. She was, however, counting on Philippe, and was even surprised that he had not already been with his 200 francs. It was awful ill luck. 2 days before she had again rigged out satin, a regular trousseau, spending nearly 1,200 francs in dresses and underclothing, and she had not a louis left. Towards 2 o'clock, as Nana was beginning to be anxious, Labordette called. He brought the designs for the bedstead. It was a diversion, and produced a fit of joy which caused the young woman to forget everything else. She clapped her hands, she danced. Then, brimful of curiosity, leaning over a table in the parlour, she examined the drawings, which Labordette explained to her. "You see, this is the boat. In the centre a bunch of full-blown roses, then a garland of flowers and buds. The leaves will be in green gold and the roses in red gold. And this is the great design for the head, a troop of cupids dancing in a circle against the silver trellis." But Nana interrupted him, carried away by rapture. "Oh, isn't he funny, the little one, the one in the corner, turning a somersault? And look at his saucy laugh. They've all got such wicked eyes. I say, my boy, I shall have to be careful of what I do before them." She was in an extraordinary state of satisfied pride. The goldsmiths had said that no queen ever slept on such a bedstead. Only there was a slight complication. Labordette showed her 2 designs for the piece at the foot, the one that reproduced the subject of the boat and cupids, the other which was altogether a new design, a female figure representing Night enveloped in her veil, which a fawn was drawing aside, displaying her radiant nudity. He added that if she selected this second design, the goldsmiths intended to make the figure representing Night like her. This idea, which was in questionable taste, made her turn pale with pleasure. She saw herself as a little silver statue, the symbol of the tepid, voluptuous pleasures of darkness. "Of course, you will only sit for the head and shoulders," said Labordette. "Why?" asked she, coolly, looking him in the face. "As it is a question of a work of art, I shan't care a fig for the sculptor who copies me." So it was settled. She chose the second subject also, but he stopped her. "Wait, it will cost 6,000 francs more." "Well, that's all the same to me," cried she, bursting out laughing. "My little Muff will pay." It was thus she called Count Muffat now amongst her intimate acquaintances, and the gentleman never asked him otherwise than as, "Did you see your little Muff last night? Ah, I thought I should have found the little Muff here." A simple familiarity which, however, she did not as yet allow herself to make use of in his presence. Labordette rolled up the drawings as he gave her some final information. The goldsmiths engaged to deliver the bedstead in 2 months' time, towards the 25th December. The very next week a sculptor would come to make the rough model for the figure of Night. As she walked with him to the stairs, Nana remembered the baker and said suddenly, "By the way, do you happen to have 10 louis about you?" One of Labordate's principles, and which he found invaluable, was never to lend money to women. He always gave the same answer: "No, my girl, I'm quite stumped. But would you like me to call on your little muff?" She refused. It was useless. 2 days before, she'd got 5,000 francs out of the Count. Following Labordette, though it was scarcely 2:30 when he called, the baker reappeared, and he roughly seated himself on a bench in the hall, swearing very loud. The young woman was listening to him up on the first floor. She turned pale. She suffered especially at hearing up there the secret joy of the servants. They were splitting their sides with laughing in the kitchen. The coachman looked on from the yard. Francois passed across the hall without any necessity, and then went and told the others how things were progressing, after bestowing a chuckle of intelligence on the baker. They did not care a straw for Madame. The walls seemed bursting with the sounds of their mirth. She felt herself all alone, despised by her servants, who spied on her and bespattered her with their filthy jokes. Then, as she had had an idea of borrowing the 133 francs from Zoe, she gave it up. She already owed her some money. She was too proud to risk a refusal. So strong an emotion possessed her that she returned to her bedroom, saying aloud, "Never mind, my girl, only depend upon yourself. Your body's your own, and it's best to make use of it rather than to submit to an insult." And without even ringing for Zoe, she hastily dressed herself to go to old Tricon's. It was her supreme resource in the hours of great distress. Very much asked for, always required by the old woman, she refused or accepted according to her wants. And the days, which were becoming more and more frequent, when she suffered from any embarrassment in her royal career, she was always sure of finding 25 louis awaiting her there. She would go to old Tricon's in the easy style gained by habit, the same as poor people go to the pawn shop. But on leaving her bedroom, she ran up against Georges, standing in the middle of the parlor. She did not notice his wax-like paleness, the dull light in his wide-open eyes. She uttered a sigh of relief. "Ah, you've come from your brother?" "No," said the youngster, turning paler still. Then she made a gesture of despair. What did he want? Why was he standing in front of her? Come, she was in a hurry, and she passed him. Then, retracing her steps, she asked, "Have you any money with you?" "No." "It's true. How stupid of me. Never a thing, not even the 6 sous for their omnibus. Mamma won't." What men! And she was hurrying off, but he stopped her. He wished to speak to her. She, excited, kept saying that she had not time, when with a word he made her leave off. "Listen, I know you're going to marry my brother." Well, that was comic. She dropped into a chair to laugh at her ease. "Yes," continued the youngster, "and I will not have it. It is I whom you must marry. That is why I've come." "Eh, what? You also?" she exclaimed. "Is it then a family complaint? But never! What an idea! Did I ever ask you to do such a disgraceful thing? Neither the one nor the other. Never!" Then George's face brightened up. He might by chance have been mistaken. He resumed, "Then swear to me that you are not my brother's mistress." "Ah, you're becoming a confounded nuisance," said Nana, rising to her feet, impatient to be off. "It's funny for a minute, but I tell you I'm in a hurry. I'm your brother's mistress when I choose to be. Do you keep me? Do you pay here that you come and call me to account? Yes, I'm your brother's mistress." He had seized her arm and squeezed it almost enough to break it, as he stammered out, "Don't say that! Don't say that!" With a slap she freed herself. "He's whipping me now, the young monkey! My little fellow, you must be off, and at once, too. I've let you be here through kindness. It's just so, however wide you may open your eyes. You didn't expect, I suppose, to have me for your mamma until the day of my death. I've something better to do than to nurse brats." He listened to her in an agony which stiffened his limbs and left him powerless. Each word stabbed him to the heart, with a blow so hard that he felt it was killing him. She, not even noticing his suffering, continued, happy at being able to vent herself on him for all her worries of the morning. "It's just the same with your brother. He's a nice one, he is. He promised me 200 francs. Ah, well, I may wait forever for him. It's not that I care about his money, not enough to pay for my pomades. But he's left me in a fix. Now, would you like to know? Well, through your brother's fault, I'm going out to earn 25 louis from another man." Then, in a state of bewilderment, he stood before the door, and he cried and implored, clasping his hands together and muttering, "Oh, no! Oh, no!" "Well, I'm willing," said she. "Have you the money?" No, he had not got the money. He would have given his life to have had it. Never before had he felt so miserable, so useless, such a child. All his poor body, shaken with sobs, expressed a grief so great that she ended by seeing it and feeling for him. She pushed him gently on one side. "Come, Ducky, let me pass. You must. Be reasonable. You're a baby, and it was all very nice for a week, but today I must attend to my affairs. Think it over now. Your brother, too, is a man. I don't say with him, do me a kindness. Don't mention to him anything of all this. He has no need to know where I'm going. I always say too much when I'm angry." She laughed. Then, putting her arms round him and kissing him on the forehead, she added, "Goodbye, baby. It's over, all over, you understand. Now I'm off." And she left him. He was standing in the center of the parlor. The last word sounded like a knell in his ears. It is over, all over, and the ground seemed to open beneath his feet. In the vacuum of his brain, the man who was awaiting Nana had disappeared. Philippe alone remained, continually in the woman's bare arms. She did not deny it. She certainly loved him, as she wished to spare him the grief of knowing her to be unfaithful. It was over, all over. He drew a long breath. He gazed around the room, choked by a weight that was crushing him. Recollections returned to him one by one. The merry nights at La Mignotte, hours of love during which he thought himself her child, then voluptuous pleasures snatched in that very room, and never, never more. He was too little. He had not grown quick enough. Philippe had taken his place because he had a beard. So it was the end. He could no longer live. His vice had become full of an infinite tenderness, of a sensual adoration in which his whole being was centered. Then, how could he forget, when his brother would remain there? His brother, who was of the same blood, another self whose pleasure drove him mad with jealousy? It was the end. He wished to die. All the doors were left open as the servants noisily scuttled about, they having seen Madame go out on foot. Downstairs, on the bench in the hall, the baker was laughing with Charles and Francois. As Zoe crossed the parlor at a run, she appeared surprised at seeing Georges, and asked him if he was waiting for Madame. Yes, he was waiting for her. He had forgotten to tell her something. And when he was again alone, he ferreted about. Finding nothing better, he took from a dressing-room a pair of sharply pointed scissors, which Nana was continually using, cutting her hangnails and little hairs with them. Then, for an hour, he waited patiently, his hand in his pocket, his fingers nervously clutching the scissors. "Here's Madame," said Zoe, coming back. She'd probably been watching for her out of the bedroom window. More scuttling about was heard in the house, and sounds of laughter died away as the doors were closed. Georges heard Nana pay the baker and utter a few brief words. Then she came up the stairs. "What, you're still here?" said she, as she caught sight of him. "Ah, we shall have a row, my little man." He followed her whilst she moved towards the bedchamber. "Nana, will you marry me?" But she shrugged her shoulders. It was too absurd. She did not answer. Her idea was to bang the door in his face. "Nana, will you marry me?" She slammed the door. With one hand he opened it, whilst he withdrew the other hand holding the scissors from his pocket. And simply with one violent blow he thrust them into his chest. Nana, however, had had a feeling that something terrible was going to happen. She turned round. When she saw him strike himself, she was seized with indignation. "But he's cracked! He's cracked! And with my scissors, too! Will you leave off, you wicked child? Ah, good heavens! Ah, good heavens!" She was seized with fear. The youngster, fallen on his knees, had struck himself a second blow which had laid him flat on the carpet. He blocked the threshold of the bedroom. Then she became quite bewildered. She shouted with all her might, not daring to step over that body which shut her in and prevented her running for help. "Zoe! Zoe, come quick! Make him leave off! It's absurd! A child like that! He's killing himself now, and in my house, too! Did anyone ever see such a thing?" He frightened her. He was all white and his eyes were closed. The wound scarcely bled at all. There was only a little blood which trickled from under the waistcoat. She'd nerved herself to pass over the body, when an apparition caused her to draw back. Opposite to her, by the open door of the parlour, she beheld an old lady advancing, and she recognized Madame Rougon, terrified, unable to account for her presence. She continued to step back. She still wore her bonnet and gloves. Her terror became such that she attempted to defend herself in a hesitating voice. "Madame, it was not I swear to you. He wanted to marry me. I said no, and he's killed himself." Madame Rougon slowly approached, dressed in black, with her pale face and white hair. In the carriage, the thought of Georges had left her, and Philippe's sin had alone occupied her mind. Perhaps that woman could give some explanations to the judges, which might cause them to be more lenient, and her intention was to implore her to bear witness in her son's favor. Downstairs the doors of the mansion were wide open. She hesitated at the staircase with her poor legs, when suddenly shouts of fear had directed her steps. Then upstairs she beheld a man lying on the floor, his shirt stained with blood. It was Georges. It was her other child. Nana kept repeating in an idiotic way, "He wanted to marry me. I said no, and he's killed himself." Without a cry, Madame Rougon stooped down. Yes, it was the other one. It was Georges. The one dishonored, the other dead. It did not surprise her in the downfall of her whole existence. Kneeling on the carpet, ignoring the place where she was, noticing no one, she looked fixedly in Georges's face. She listened with a hand upon his heart. Suddenly she uttered a faint sigh. She'd felt his heart beat. Then she raised her head, examined the room and the woman, and seemed to recollect. A fire lighted up her vacant eyes. She was so grand and so terrible that Nana trembled as she continued to defend herself over that corpse which separated them. This ends Chapter 13, Part 1 of Nana. Chapter 13, Part 2 of Nana by Émile Zola. Translated by Burton Rasco. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 13, Part 2 of Nana. "I swear to you, madame, if his brother was here, he could explain." "His brother is a thief. He is in prison," said the mother harshly. Nana remained transfixed, gasping for breath. But why all that? The other had robbed. They were mad, then, in that family. She ceased struggling, no longer seeming to be in her own house, but leaving Madame Rougon to give her own orders. Some of the servants had at last hastened to the spot. The old lady insisted on having Georges, insensible as he was, taken to her carriage. She would remove him from that house, though it killed him. Nana, with a stupefied gaze, watched the servants carrying that poor Zizi by his legs and shoulders. The mother followed behind, quite exhausted now, leaning on the furniture as though sunk into the nothingness of all she loved. On the landing she sighed, and turning round said twice, "Ah, you have done us much harm. You have done us much harm." That was all. Nana seated herself in her stupor, with her gloves still on her hands and her bonnet on her head. The house relapsed into a dull silence. The carriage had just gone off, and she remained immovable, without an idea, her head all buzzing with what had just transpired. A quarter of an hour later, Count Moufat found her in the same place. But then she eased herself with a great flow of words, telling him of the misfortune, repeating 20 times the same details, picking up the scissors smeared with blood, to imitate Zizi's gesture when he stabbed himself. And she seemed especially anxious to prove her innocence. "Come now, darling, was it my fault? If you were justice, would you condemn me? I never told Philippe to steal, that's very certain, any more than I drove this poor fellow to kill himself. In all this, I'm the most miserable. They come and make fools of themselves here. They cause me a great deal of pain. I'm treated like a wretch of a woman." And she burst out crying. Her nerves were highly unstrung, which rendered her weak and doleful, and deeply moved with an immense sorrow. "You too, you don't seem very pleased. Ask Zoe now if I'm at all to blame. Zoe, speak, explain to the Count." For some few minutes the maid, having fetched from the dressing-room a towel and a basin of water, had been rubbing the carpet to get rid of a stain of blood, whilst it was still wet. "Oh, sir," she declared, "Madame is quite broken-hearted." Moufat was greatly affected, feeling stunned by the drama, his thoughts full of that mother weeping for her 2 children. He knew her great heart. He saw her in her widow's weeds, pining away all alone at Les Fondettes. But Nana's despair increased. Now the picture of Zizi lying on the floor, with a red spot on his shirt, put her quite beside herself. "He was so pretty, so gentle, so caressing. Ah, you know, ducky, it's so much the worse if you don't like it. I loved him, the baby. I can't control myself. It's stronger than I am. And then it can't matter to you now. He's no longer here. You have what you wanted. You may be quite sure of never catching us together again." This last idea overwhelmed him with such regret that he ended by trying to console her. She must bear up. She was right. It was not her fault. But she stopped him to say, "Listen, you must run and bring me news of him, at once. I insist." He took his hat and went off to obtain news of Georges. When he returned, at the end of 3/4 of an hour, he beheld Nana leaning out of the window, anxiously awaiting him, and he called to her from the pavement that the little fellow was not dead, and that they even hoped to save his life. Then she changed at once to a great joy. She sang, danced, and thought life beautiful. Zoe, however, was not satisfied with her cleansing. She kept looking at the stain and saying each time she passed, "You know, madame, it hasn't gone away." And in fact, as it dried, the stain appeared a pale red on one of the white ornaments of the carpet. It was on the very threshold of the room, like a line of blood barring the way. "Bah!" said Nana, happy once more. "The footsteps will wear it away." By the morrow, Count Moufat had also forgotten the incident. When in the cab on the way to the Rue Richelieu, he had sworn never to return to that woman. Heaven gave him a warning. He looked on Philippe's and Georges' calamity as foreboding his own ruin. But neither the spectacle of Madame Rougon in tears, nor the sight of the youth consumed with fever, had the power to make him keep his oath. And from the short moment of emotion caused by the drama, all that remained to him was the secret joy of being rid of a rival whose charming youth had always exasperated him. He now experienced an exclusive passion, one of those passions of men who have had no youth. He loved Nana with the necessity always to know that she was his alone, to hear her, to touch her, to be under the influence of her breath. It was an attachment which had got beyond the mere gratification of his senses and had reached the purer feeling, an anxious affection, jealous of the past, dreaming at times of redemption, of pardon bestowed, both of them kneeling before God the Father. Each day religion regained some of its ascendancy over him. He again practiced going to confession and communicating, struggling unceasingly, mingling his remorse with the joys of sin and of penitence. Then, his spiritual director having permitted him to wear out his passion, he made a habit of that daily damnation, which he redeemed by bursts of faith full of a devout humility. He very naively offered to heaven, as an expiatory suffering, the abominable torment he endured. This torment continued to increase. It raised his Calvary of a believer, of a grave and profound heart, fallen into the mad sensuality of a courtesan. What caused him the most agony were the continual infidelities of that woman, for he could not accustom himself to share with others, failing to understand her stupid infatuations. He longed for an eternal love, ever the same. Yet she had sworn to be faithful, and he paid her for that. But he felt that she lied, unable to guard herself, giving herself to her friends and the passers-by like some good animal born to live in a state of nakedness. One morning that he observed Foucarmant leaving her house at a rather peculiar hour, he sought an explanation. She at once flew into a passion, tired of his jealousy. She had already on several occasions been very nice. For instance, the night when he had caught her with Georges, she'd been the first to make it up, admitting her fault, loading him with caresses and pretty words to help him get over it. But at length he bored her with his obstinacy in not understanding women, and she roughly said, "Well, yes, I've been Foucarmont's mistress. What next, eh? That puts your hair out of curl, my little muff." It was the first time she called him little muff to his face. He remained bursting with rage at the brazenness of her avowal, and as he clenched his fists, she walked towards him and looked him straight in the face. "Now, that's enough, do you hear? If it doesn't please you, just oblige me by going off. I won't have you kicking up a row in my house. Understand that I intend to be free to do as I like. When a man pleases me, I'll have him here. Exactly, that's what I mean, and you must make up your mind at once. Yes or no? The door is open." She had gone and opened the door. He did not go. So now it became her way of attaching him to her all the more. For nothing at all, at the least quarrel, she gave him his choice, accompanied by some of the most abominable reflections. Ah, well, she would always be able to find someone better than he. She had only too many people to choose from. One could pick up men outside, as many as one wanted, and fellows who were not such ninnies as he, whose blood boiled in their veins. He bowed his head. He waited for better times, when she would be in want of money. Then she became caressing, and he forgot everything. A night of love compensated for the tortures of a week. His reconciliation with his wife had made his home unbearable. The Countess, cast off by Fauchery, who was once more completely under Rose's influence, sought forgetfulness in other amours, in the attack of the feverish anxiety of her 40 years, ever nervous and filling the house with the exasperating commotion of her mode of living. Since her marriage, Estelle no longer saw her father. This skinny and insignificant-looking girl had suddenly developed into a woman with an iron will so absolute that Dagonet trembled before her. Now he accompanied her to church, converted and furious with his father-in-law, who was ruining them with an abandoned female. M. Verneau alone remained affectionate towards the Count, whilst biding his time. He had even succeeded in gaining access to Nana. He frequented the two houses, where one often came across his continual smile behind the doors. And Muffat, miserable in his own home, driven from thence by dullness and shame, preferred rather to live amidst the insults of the Avenue de Villiers. Soon only one question remained between Nana and the Count, that of money. One day, after formally promising to bring 10,000 francs, he had dared to present himself at the appointed time empty-handed. For the previous 2 days she had been exciting him with endless caresses. Such a breaking of his word, so many endearing little ways wasted, threw her into an abusive rage. She became quite white. "Eh, you've no money? Then, my little muff, return to whence you came, and quicker than that, too. What a sordid wretch! And he was going to kiss me! No money, no anything, you understand?" He entered into some explanations. He would have the money the day after tomorrow. But she interrupted him violently. "And my bills that are coming due! They'll seize my goods, whilst my lordship comes here on tick. Now, just look at yourself. Do you think I love you for yourself? When one has a mug like yours, one pays the women who are willing to put up with you. Damnation! If you don't bring me the 10,000 francs tonight, you shan't even so much as suck the tip of my little finger. Really, I must send you back to your wife." That night he brought the 10,000 francs. Nana held out her lips. He took a long kiss, which consoled him for all his day of agony. What annoyed the young woman was always having him attached to her skirts. She complained to Monsieur Venot, imploring him to take her little muff to the Countess. Their reconciliation did not appear to have been of much use, and she regretted having had anything to do with it, as he was forever at her back. The days when, blinded by anger, she forgot her interests, she swore to pay him such a dirty trick that he would never again be able to come near her. But while she blackguarded him, slapping her thighs meanwhile, she might even have spat in his face, he would have remained and thanked her. Then they had continual quarrels about money. She roughly demanded it. She abused him in regard to the most miserable sums, odiously greedy every minute, delighting in cruelly telling him that she only tolerated him for his money and for nothing else, that she didn't care for him, that she loved another, and that she was very unfortunate in having to do with such an idiot as he. They did not even want to have him any longer at court, where there was a talk of requesting him to send in his resignation. The Empress had said, "He is too disgusting." That was very true, and Nana always repeated the words as a parting shot in their quarrels. "Really, you are too disgusting." She no longer put the least constraint upon herself now. She had regained complete liberty. Every day she took her drive in the Bois round the lake, forming acquaintances there which became more intimate elsewhere. It was the great angling match for men, the baiting in the full light of day, the hooking by illustrious harlots, beneath the smile of toleration and the dazzling luxury of Paris. Duchesses drew each other's attention to her. The wives of wealthy tradesmen copied her bonnets. At times her landau, when striving to pass, would arrest a long string of grand equipages, containing financiers holding all Europe in their cash boxes, and ministers whose big fingers were half throttling France. And she formed a part of this world of the Bois. She occupied an important position there, known by the people of every capital, greatly in demand with all foreigners, adding the mad fit of her debauchery to the splendors of that crowd, like the very glory, mere birds of passage, of which she herself lost all recollection on the morrow, would take her to the grand restaurants, often to the Café de Madrid, when the weather was fine. All the staff of the embassies defiled there. She dined with Lucy Stuart, who murdered the French language, and who paid to be amused, taking the girls at so much an evening, with instructions to them to be funny, while they themselves were so sick of everything, and so worn out that they never even touched them. And the girls called it going on the spree. They returned home delighted at having been treated with such disdain, and finished the night with some lover of their choice. Count Muffat pretended to be ignorant of these goings-on, when Nana did not tell him of them herself. He suffered, too, a great deal from the disgraces of his daily existence. The mansion in the Avenue de Villiers was becoming a regular hell, a madhouse in which sudden crazes at all hours of the day led to the most odious scenes. Nana had arrived at the point of battling with her servants. At one time she was especially good to Charles, the coachman. Whenever she stopped at a restaurant, she sent him out refreshments by the waiters. She would talk to him from inside her landau, highly amused, thinking him very funny as he roundly abused the other drivers whenever there was a block in the street. Then, without rhyme or reason, she completely changed and treated him as a fool. She was always wrangling about the straw, bran, and the oats. In spite of her love for animals, she considered that her horses ate too much. So at length, one settling day, as she accused him of robbing her, Charles flew into a passion and bluntly called her a strumpet. Her horses, anyhow, were worth more than she. They did not let anyone muck them about. She retorted in a similar style, and the Count was obliged to separate them and turn the coachman off the premises. But this was only the beginning of a general stampede of the servants. Victorine and Francois went off after the discovery of a robbery of diamonds. Even Julien disappeared, and a story was circulated that the Count had implored him to go, giving him at the same time a large sum of money, because Madame had taken a great fancy to him. Every week fresh faces were seen in the servants' hall. Never had there been such waste. The house was like a passage through which the scum of the servants' registry offices defiled in a massacring gallop. Zoe alone kept her place, with her neat look and her only anxiety of organizing the disorder, so long as she had not saved sufficient to settle down on her own account, a plan which she had been working at for a long time past. And yet those were only the avowable cares. The Count bore with Madame Maloire's stupidity, playing at bézique with her, in spite of her rank odor. He put up with Madame Lerat and her cackling, and with little Louis and his doleful complaints of a child devoured by disease, some putrefaction bequeathed by an unknown father. But he had to endure other things far worse. One night, behind a door, he'd heard Nana furiously telling her maid that a pretended rich man had just taken her in. Yes, a handsome fellow who said he was American and owned gold mines in his own country. A mean vagabond who'd gone off whilst she was asleep without leaving a sou behind, and even taking a packet of cigarette papers away with him. And the Count, very pale, had crept downstairs again on tiptoe, so that he might feign ignorance of the occurrence. On another occasion he was obliged to be aware of everything. Nana, infatuated with a singer at a music hall and forsaken by him, wanted to commit suicide in a fit of gloomy sentimentality. She swallowed a glass of water in which she'd soaked a handful of matches, and was horribly ill in consequence, but did not die. The Count had to nurse her and listen to the story of her passion, intermingled with tears and oaths never to care for men again. In her contempt for the pigs, as she called them, she could not, however, keep her heart free, having always some sweetheart about her skirts, and indulging in the most inexplicable caprices, through the depraved tastes of her wearied body. Since Zoe relaxed her supervision to meet her own ends, the good management of the household had disappeared to the extent that Muffat dared not open a door, draw a curtain, or look into a cupboard. The machinery no longer worked. Gentlemen were hanging about everywhere. At every minute they were knocking up against each other. Now he invariably coughed before entering a room, having almost found the young woman with her arms round Francis's neck one evening that he had left the dressing-room for a couple of minutes to order the carriage, whilst the hairdresser was giving a few finishing touches to Madame's hair. It was for ever sudden abandonments behind his back, pleasures snatched in odd corners, quickly, and in her chemise or in her most gorgeous costumes, with whoever happened to be with her. Then, delighted with her robbery, she would rejoin him, looking very red in the face. With him there would have been no pleasure. He was such an abominable nuisance. In the agony of his jealousy, the unhappy man had reached the state of feeling easy whenever he left Nana and Satin alone together. He would have encouraged her in this connection for the sake of keeping the men away, But on this side also everything went wrong. Nana deceived Satin, the same as she deceived the Count, having a rage for the most monstrous crazes, picking up girls from the street corners. When returning home in her carriage, she would at times become enamored of some strumpet caught sight of on the pavement. Her senses inflamed, her imagination kindled, and she would take the woman with her, then pay her and send her away. At other times, disguised as a man, she would frequent houses of ill repute and witness spectacles of debauchery which helped her to forget her weariness. And Satin, annoyed at being continually forsaken, would disturb the house with the most atrocious scenes. She had ended by gaining complete mastery over Nana, who respected her. Muffat even thought of allying himself with her. When he did not dare to do anything himself, he would set Satin to work. Twice she had made her darling take him back, whilst he showed himself very obliging, giving her a word of warning or making himself scarce at the least sign. Only the understanding did not last long, for Satin too was cracked. On certain days she would smash everything, feeling half dead, ruining what little health she had left in excesses of anger or of dissipation, looking pretty, though, in spite of all. So he probably set her off, for she took her into corners as though she wished to gain her over in the interests of that grand business of hers, that plan of which he had never yet spoken to anyone. Singular fits of revolt, however, still took possession of Count Muffat. He who had tolerated Satin for months past, who had ended by accepting strangers, all that troop of men galloping through Nana's bedroom, became enraged at the idea of being deceived by any of his friends or even acquaintances. When she owned to him her intimacy with Foucarmont, he suffered so much, he considered the young man's treachery so abominable, that he wished to provoke him to a duel. As he did not know whom to ask to be his seconds in such an affair, he consulted Labourdette. The latter was so astounded that he could not refrain from laughing. "A duel about Nana? But, dear sir, all Paris would laugh at you. No one could fight for Nana. It would be too ridiculous." The Count became very pale. He made a violent gesture. "Then I will strike him in the street before everyone." For an hour Labourdette had to reason with him. A blow would make the story odious. By the evening everyone would know the real cause of the meeting. He would be the laughing-stock of the newspapers. And Labourdette kept returning to this conclusion. Impossible! It would be too ridiculous. Each time these words fell upon Muffat sharp and clean like the blow of a knife. He could not even fight for the woman he loved. Everyone would split their sides with laughing. Never before had he so painfully felt the misery of his love, that solemn feeling of his heart lost in that fooling of pleasure. This was his last revolt. He let himself be convinced. From that time he assisted at the procession of his friends, of all the men who lived there in the privacy of the mansion. In a few months Nana devoured them greedily, one after the other. The increasing requirements of her luxury whetted her appetite. She cleaned a man out with the crunch of her teeth. First she had Foucarmont, who did not last a fortnight. He had dreamed of leaving the navy. In 10 years of a seafaring life he had saved some 30,000 francs, which he wanted to risk in the United States, and his prudent and even miserly instincts were silenced. He gave all, even his signature, to accommodation bills, thus affecting his future. When Nana turned him adrift, he was penniless. However, she showed herself very kind-hearted. She advised him to return to his ship. What was the use of being obstinate? As he had no money left, he could not possibly remain with her. He ought to understand that and be reasonable. A ruined man fell from her hands like ripe fruit, to rot on the earth all by himself. Next, Nana tackled Steiner without disgust, but also without love. She called him a dirty Jew. She seemed to be gratifying an old hatred which she could not very well explain to herself. He was fat, he was stupid, and she turned him about, taking double mouthfuls, wishing to have done with the Prussian all the quicker. He'd given up Simone. His Bosphorus speculation was already in jeopardy. Nana hastened his downfall by the most lavish expenditure. For a month still he struggled, performing miracles. He covered Europe with a colossal publicity, posters, advertisements, prospectuses, and extracted money from the most distant countries. All those savings, the louis of the speculators, the same as the sous of the poor people, were swallowed up in the Avenue de Villiers. He had also gone into partnership with an iron founder in Alsace. There were there, in a corner of the country, workmen black with coal dust, bathed with perspiration, who night and day tightened their muscles and heard their bones crack to supply the means for Nana's pleasures. She devoured all like a great fire, the thefts at the Bourse, the earnings of labor. This time she finished Steiner. She returned him to the pavement, sucked to the bone, so empty that he remained even incapable of inventing a fresh roguery. In the collapse of his banking establishment he went crazy. He trembled at the name of the police. He was made a bankrupt, and the mere word money bewildered him, threw him into a childish state of embarrassment. He who had handled millions. One evening, when with her, he burst out crying. He asked her to lend him 100 francs to pay his servant, and Nana, affected and amused by this ending of a terrible old man who for 20 years past had been skimming the Paris market, brought him the money, saying, "You know, I give 'em you because it's funny. But listen, my little man, you're not of an age for me to keep you. You must seek some other occupation." Then Nana at once started on La Falloise. He had for a long time been soliciting the honor of being ruined by her, so as to be a perfect swell. That was what he was in want of. He must have a woman to bring him out. In 2 months Paris would know him, and he would read his own name in all the newspapers. 6 weeks sufficed. His inheritance consisted of landed estates, fields, pastures, woods, and farms. He had to sell them rapidly, one after the other. At every bite Nana devoured an acre. The foliage frizzling beneath the sun, the rich ripe corn, the golden vines in September, the tall grass in which the cows buried themselves up to their shoulders, all went as though engulfed in some abyss. And there were also a stream, a lime quarry, and 3 windmills which disappeared. Nana passed like an invading army, like one of those clouds of locusts which flight destroys a whole province similar to a flame of fire. She burnt the earth wherever she placed her tiny foot. Farm after farm, meadow after meadow, she nibbled up the inheritance in her pretty way, without even noticing what she was about, just the same as she would crunch up a bag of burnt almonds placed on her knees between her meals. It was a matter of no consequence. They were merely sweeties. But one night there only remained a small wood. She swallowed it with a disdainful air, for it was really not worth the trouble of opening one's mouth for. La Falloise laughed in an idiotic way as he sucked the knob of his walking-stick. Debts were crushing him down. He no longer possessed 100 francs of income. He saw himself obliged to go back to the country and live with a maniacal uncle. But that did not matter. He was a swell. The Figaro had twice printed his name, and with his skinny neck rising out of his collar slightly turned down in front, his waist encased in a waistcoat a great deal too tight, he swaggered about, uttering exclamations like a parrot, and affecting the languors of a wooden puppet that had never had an emotion. Nana, whom he irritated immensely, ended by beating him. Fauchery, however, had returned, brought by his cousin. The unfortunate Fauchery at this time had become quite a family man. After breaking off with the Countess, he found himself in the hands of Rose, who treated him as a real husband. Mignon simply remained Madame's major domo. Installed as master, the journalist used to lie to Rose, and whenever he received her, had to take all sorts of precautions, full of the scruples of a good spouse desirous of at length settling down. Nana's triumph was to hook him and to devour a newspaper he had started with the money of one of his friends. She did not openly go about with him. She took a delight, on the contrary, in treating him as a gentleman who must conceal his movements, and whenever she spoke of Rose, she would say, That poor Rose! The newspaper supplied her with flowers for a couple of months. She had subscribers in the country. She took everything from a leading article to the theatrical notes. Then, after wearing out the editors, dislocating the management, she satisfied one of her big caprices, a winter garden in a corner of her mansion, which carried off the printing establishment. It was merely by way of amusement, however. When Mignon, delighted with what was taking place, hastened to see if he could not fix Fauchery on her for good, she asked him if he was poking fun at her. A fellow without a sou, living on his articles and his plays. Not if she knew it. Such stupidity was only worthy of a woman of talent like that poor Rose. And, full of mistrust, fearing some underhand dealing on Mignon's part, who was quite capable of denouncing them to his wife, she dismissed Fauchery, who for some time had only been paying her in advertisements. But she remembered him with pleasure. They had amused themselves so much together with that idiot Lafaloise. They would never perhaps have thought of being together again if the pleasure of humbugging such a fool had not excited them. It seemed to them so funny. They would embrace each other under his nose. They lived the merriest possible life at his expense. They would send him on some errand to the other end of Paris whenever they wanted to be alone together. Then, when he returned, they would make jokes and allusions that he was unable to understand. One day, incited by the journalist, she bet that she would give Lafaloise a slap in the face. That very evening she did so, then continued to beat him, finding it amusing, and delighted at being able to show what cowards men were. She called him her slapping machine, told him to come up and receive his slaps which made her hand quite red, because she was not yet accustomed to the exercise. Lafaloise laughed in his idiotic way, with his eyes full of tears. This familiarity delighted him. He thought it grand. "You don't know," said he one night, very excited after receiving a shower of blows. "You ought to marry me. Shouldn't we make a jolly couple?" It was not an empty remark. He had slyly projected this marriage, seized with a mania for astonishing Paris. Nana's husband. What an effect! A rather grand apotheosis. But Nana snuffed him out in fine style. "I marry you? Well, if I'd been worried with any such idea, I could long ago have found a husband. And a man who would be worth 20 such as you, my little fellow. I have received no end of proposals. Come, reckon them up with me. Philippe, Georges, Foucarmont, Steiner, there's 4, without counting the others whom you don't know. They all sing the same chorus. I can't be nice with them without they at once start off singing, 'Will you marry me? Will you marry me?'" She was becoming excited. Then she burst out indignantly, "Well, no, I won't. Was I ever made for such a life as that? Look at me. I should no longer be Nana if I saddled myself with a husband. And besides, it's too disgusting." And she spat on the ground. She hiccuped with disgust, as though she saw all the filth of the earth spreading beneath her. One night Lafaloise disappeared. A week later it was stated that he was in the country with his uncle, who had a mania for botanizing. He mounted his specimens, and stood a chance of marrying a cousin who was very ugly and extremely devout. Nana did not weep for him much. She merely said to the Count, "Well, my little muff, that's another rival the less. You're in high feather today." But he was becoming serious. He wanted to marry me. As he turned pale, she laughingly put her arms round his neck, thrusting each of her cruelties into him with a caress. This ends Chapter 13, Part 2 of Nana. Chapter 13, Part 3 of Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rasco. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 13, Part 3 of Nana. And it's that which bothers you, isn't it? You can't marry Nana. Whilst they are all trying to get me to marry them, you're chafing all alone in your corner. It's not possible. You must wait till your wife croaks. Ah, if your wife was to croak, wouldn't you just hasten to me? Wouldn't you just throw yourself at my feet and offer me everything? All the usual style with sighs and tears and protestations. Eh, darling? It would be so nice. Her voice had become soft. She fooled him with an air of ferocious cajolery. He, deeply moved, blushed as he returned her embraces. Then she cried, "Damn it all! To think that I guessed right! He has thought of it. He's waiting till his wife croaks. Ah, well, this is too much. He's a bigger scamp than the others." Muffat had accepted the others. Now he made it a last point of dignity to remain the master with the servants and the frequenters of the house, the man who, giving the most, was the official lover. And his passion became madder than ever. He kept his place by paying, buying even smiles at fabulous prices, often robbed and never receiving his money's worth. But it was like a disease that was devouring him. He could not help suffering from it. When he entered Nana's bedroom, he contented himself with opening the windows for a minute, so as to get rid of the odors left by the others, the effluvia of both dark and fair, the cigar smoke, the staleness of which nearly suffocated him. The room was becoming a public square. Boots of all kinds were continually being wiped on the threshold, and not one was arrested by that bloody mark which barred the entry. Zoe was greatly worried by that stain, merely a tidy girl's mania. She was annoyed at always seeing it there. Her eyes were attracted to it in spite of herself. She never entered Madame's room without saying, "It's funny it doesn't go away. Yet a great many people come here." Nana, who'd been receiving better news of Georges, then in a state of convalescence at Les Fondettes with his mother, each time made the same reply. "Ah, well, you must give it time. It's gradually becoming paler beneath the footsteps." And indeed, each one of the gentlemen, Foucarmont, Steiner, La Falloise, Fauchery, and the others, had carried away a little of the stain on the soles of their boots. And Muffat, who was worried as much as Zoe by the mark of blood, studied it in spite of himself, to read, as it were, in its rosier and rosier effacement, the number of men who passed there. He had a secret dread of it, always stepping over it through a sudden fear of crushing something living, a naked limb lying on the floor. Then in that room an unconquerable feeling intoxicated him. He forgot all, the mob of other men who passed through it, the mourning that barred the door. Outside, at times, in the open air of the street, he would shed tears of shame and indignation and swear never to return there. And the moment he passed the threshold, he was recaptured. He felt his will give way in the warmth of the apartment, his flesh penetrated with a perfume, overpowered by a voluptuous desire of annihilation. He, devout and used to the rapturous feelings enkindled by the contemplation of gorgeous shrines, experienced exactly the same sensations of a believer as when, kneeling in some church, he became entranced by the sound of the organ and the perfume of the incense. The woman ruled him with the jealous despotism of a guard of anger, terrifying him, giving him seconds of joy, acute as spasms, for hours of frightful torments, of visions of hell and everlasting damnation. It was always the same stutterings, the same prayers, and the same despondencies, especially the same humilities of an accursed creature crushed beneath the mud of his origin. The desires of his flesh, the requirements of his soul, mingled and seemed to rise from the obscure depths of his being, like a single blossom of a tree of life. He abandoned himself to the power of love and faith, whose double lever animates the world. And always, in spite of the struggles of his reason, Nana's room filled him with madness. He shiveringly succumbed to the all-powerfulness of her sex, the same as he felt lost before the vast unknown of heaven. Then, when she found him so humble, Nana's triumph became tyrannical. She instinctively had a rage for debasing everything. It was not sufficient for her to destroy things. She polluted them. Her delicate hands left abominable traces behind them. They decomposed by their mere touch all that they had broken. And he, idiot that he was, lent himself to this sport, with a vague remembrance of saints devoured by lice, and who eat what they had voided. When she had him in her room, with the doors fastened, she would feast herself with the sight of man's infamy. At first it was merely fun. She would give him little slaps and make him do comical things, such as lisping like a child, repeating ends of sentences. "Say it like me, and dash it all, Coco doesn't care." He would be obedient, even to imitating her accent. "And dash it all, Coco doesn't care." Or she would do the woolly bear, on all fours on the fur rugs, in her chemise, and turning round and grunting, as though she meant to eat him up. And she would even bite his calves, just for fun. Then she would get up and say, "Now it's your turn. I bet you won't do the woolly bear as well as me." It was charming. She amused him as a bear, with her white skin and her golden mane. He laughed. He also went on all fours. He grunted and bit her calves, whilst she hopped about, pretending to be greatly frightened. "Aren't we stupid, eh?" she would end by saying. "You've no idea how ugly you look, my dear." "Ah, well, if they could only see you now at the Tuileries." But these little games soon took an ugly turn. It wasn't through cruelty on her part, for she still remained a good-natured girl. It was like a breath of madness, which passed and increased little by little in the closed room. A lewdness seemed to possess them and inspire them with the delirious imaginations of the flesh. The old devout frights of their night of wakefulness had now turned into a thirst for bestiality, a mania for going on all fours, for grunting and biting. Then one day, as he was doing the woolly bear, she pushed him so roughly that he fell against a piece of furniture, and she broke out into an involuntary laugh as she saw a bump on his forehead. From that time, having already acquired a taste for it by her experiment on La Falloise, she treated him as an animal, goaded him, and pursued him with kicks. Gee up, you're the horse. Ah, gee, dirty jade. Move along quicker than that." At other times he was a dog. She would throw her scented handkerchief to the other end of the room, and he had to go and pick it up with his teeth, crawling along on his hands and knees. "Fetch it, Caesar. I'll give you the stick if you are not quick. Good dog, Caesar. Pretty, obedient fellow. Now, beg." And he delighted in his baseness, and relished the enjoyment of being a brute. He aspired at falling still lower. He would cry out, "Hit harder! Bow wow! I'm mad! Hit away!" She was seized with a caprice. His costume. She insisted one evening on his coming arrayed in his gorgeous chamberlain's costume. Then she laughed and ridiculed him when she had him in his court dress, with the sword and the hat and the white breeches and the scarlet cloth dress coat bedizened with gold, and the symbolical key hanging over the left-hand tail. This key especially amused her, and filled her with a mad fancy for filthy explanations. Always laughing, and carried away by a disrespect for greatness, and by the delight of vilifying it beneath the official pomp of that costume, she shook him and pinched him, and kept exclaiming, "Hey, get along, you chamberlain!" ending by accompanying her words with kicks behind. And she heartily meant those kicks for the Tuileries, for the majesty of the imperial court, throning herself on high over the fear and the prostration of all. That was what she thought of society. It was her revenge, an unconscious family grudge bequeathed with the blood. Then, the chamberlain having undressed, his coat spread out on the floor, she cried to him to jump, and he jumped. She cried to him to spit, and he spat. She cried to him to walk over the gold, over the eagles, over the decorations, and he walked. Slap! Bang! There was nothing left. All had collapsed. She demolished a chamberlain as easily as she broke a scent bottle or a comfit box, and she turned him into a lump of filth, a heap of mud at a street corner. The goldsmiths, however, had not kept their word. The bedstead was not delivered until towards the middle of January. Muffat at the time was in Normandy, where he'd gone to sell a last remnant of the wreck. He was not expected back until 2 days later, but having settled his business, he hastened his return, and without even calling at the Rue Miromesnil, he went to the Avenue de Villiers. 10 o'clock was striking. As he had the key of a little door opening on to the Rue Cardinet, he entered without being noticed. Upstairs, in the parlor, Zoe, who was dusting some bronzes, was struck with amazement, and not knowing how to detain him, began telling him a long story about Monsieur Venot, who, in a most agitated state of mind, had been seeking him since the day before, that he'd already called there twice, and implored her to send the Count at once to him if he came to Madame's first. Muffat listened to her without understanding anything of the rigmarole. Then he noticed her confusion, and seized suddenly with a jealous rage of which he no longer thought himself capable. He rushed against the door of the bedroom, from whence issued sounds of laughter. The door gave way and flew open, whilst Zoe retired, shrugging her shoulders. So much the worse. As Madame was going mad, Madame must get out of the mess by herself. And Muffat, on the threshold, uttered a cry at the sight before him. "My God! My God!" The newly decorated room was resplendent in its regal luxury. Silver buttons strewed the tea-rose velvet hangings with shining stars. It was the rosy color of flesh which illuminates the sky on fine nights, when Venus sparkles at the horizon on the light background of the expiring day, whilst the cords of gold hanging down at the corners, the gold lace framing the panels, were like bright flames or loose switches of red hair, half covering the great nudity of the room, the voluptuous paleness of which they enriched. Then, opposite, was the gold and silver bedstead, which shone with the new brightness of its chasings, a throne large enough for Nana to stretch the royalty of her naked limbs, an altar of a Byzantine richness, worthy of the all-powerfulness of her sex, and on which at this very moment she displayed it, uncovered and in the religious immodesty of a dreaded idol. And near her, beneath the snowy reflection of her bosom, in the midst of her goddess-like triumph, sprawled a shameful and decrepit object, a comical and lamentable ruin, the Marquis de Chouart in his nightshirt. The Count joined his hands. Seized with a great fit of trembling, he repeated, "My God! My God!" It was for the Marquis de Chouart that the golden roses of the boat flowered, bunches of golden roses blooming amidst the golden foliage. It was for him that the cupids, dancing in a circle against the silver trellis, leant forward with a laugh of amorous sauciness. And it was for him that the fawn at his feet uncovered the sleeping nymph, wearied with voluptuousness. That figure of night, copied from Nana's celebrated nudity, even to the two amply developed thighs, which would cause everyone to recognize her. Thrown there like a piece of human rubbish, corrupted and shattered by 60 years of debauchery, the Marquise appeared as a corner of a charnel house, surrounded by the glory of the woman's dazzling flesh. When he saw the door open, he raised himself up, seized with the fright of a paralytic old man. This last night of licentiousness had smitten him with imbecility. He'd fallen into his second childhood, and, no longer able to find his words, half paralyzed, stuttering, shivering, he remained in an attitude of flight, his nightshirt rocked up over his skeleton of a body, one leg outside the clothes, a poor livid leg covered with gray hairs. Nana, in spite of her annoyance, could not help laughing. "Lie down, get under the clothes," said she, pushing him back and covering him with the sheet, like some bit of dirt one does not wish to be seen. And she ran to close the door. She'd really no luck with her little muff. He was always putting in an appearance at an awkward moment. And why, too, did he go off to seek for money in Normandy? The old fellow had brought her 4,000 francs, and she had let him have his way. She pushed the door to again and cried, "So much the worse. It's all your fault. That's not the way to enter a room. There, that'll do. Good-bye." Muffat stood in front of that closed door, utterly crushed by what he had just seen. His fit of trembling increased, a trembling which ascended from his legs to his chest and to his head. Then, like a tree caught in a hurricane, he staggered and fell on his knees, cracking in all his limbs, and despairingly holding out his hands, he muttered, "It's too much. Oh, God, it is too much." He had accepted everything, but he could no longer bear it. He felt himself without strength in that darkness where man succumbs with his reason. With an extraordinary outburst, holding high his joined hands, he sought heaven. He called on God. "Oh, no, I will not. Oh, come to me, my God. Help me, or rather let me die. Oh, no, not that man, my God. It is ended. Carry me off, that I may no longer see, that I may no longer feel. Oh, I belong to thee, my God, our Father which art in heaven." And he continued, burning with faith, and an ardent prayer came from his lips. But someone touched him on the shoulder. He raised his eyes. It was Monsieur Verneau, surprised at finding him praying before that closed door. Then, as though God himself had replied to his appeal, he threw himself into the little old man's arms. At last he could weep. He sobbed and kept repeating, "My brother, my brother." All his suffering humanity found relief in this cry. He bathed Monsieur Verneau's face with his tears. He kissed him, uttering disconnected sentences. "Oh, my brother, how I suffer! You alone are left to me, my brother. Take me away forever. Oh, for mercy's sake, take me away." Then Monsieur Verneau pressed him to his bosom. He called him his brother also, but he had another blow to deal him. Since the previous day, he had been seeking him to tell him that Countess Sabine had crowned her follies by eloping with a young man employed at a large linen draper's. A frightful scandal, of which all Paris was already gossiping. Seeing him under the influence of such a religious exaltation, he thought the moment a favorable one, and told him at once what had occurred, that flatly tragical end in which his house was foundering. The Count was not affected in the least. His wife had gone off. That was nothing to him. He would see about it later on. And, again giving way to his anguish, looking at the door, the walls, the ceiling in a terrified manner, he could do no more than utter these imploring words. "Take me away. I can bear it no longer. Take me away." Monsieur Verneau took him off like a child. From that time he was his entirely. Muffat once more returned to the strict duties of religion. His life was blasted. He had resigned his chamberlain's office in accordance with the desire of the offended modesty of the Tuileries. His daughter Estelle had commenced an action against him to recover a sum of 60,000 francs, left her by an aunt, and which she ought to have received at the time of her marriage. Ruined, and living very moderately with the remnants of his great fortune, he allowed himself to be finished little by the Countess, who devoured the leavings Nana had disdained. Sabine, corrupted by that woman's promiscuousness, incited to extremes, became the final sapper, the very canker of the home. After various adventures she had returned, and he had taken her back in the resignation of Christian pardon. She accompanied him like his living shame. But he, becoming more and more indifferent, ended by no longer suffering from such things. Heaven had rescued him from the arms of woman to place him again in the very arms of God. It was a religious prolongation of Nana's voluptuous pleasures, with the stutterings, the prayers, and the despondencies, the humilities of an accursed creature crushed beneath the mud of his origin. In the dark corners of churches, his knees chilled by the cold stones, he found again his enjoyments of former days, the spasms of his muscles and the delicious perturbations of his intelligence in the same atonement of the obscure requirements of his being. The night of the rupture, Mignon called at the Avenue de Villiers. He had got accustomed to Fauchery. He had ended by discovering 1,000 advantages in the presence of a husband at his wife's. He left to him all the little cares of the home, relied on him for an active supervision, and used the money that came from his dramatic successes for the daily expenses of the household. And as, on the other hand, Fauchery behaved very reasonably, never indulging in any ridiculous jealousy, but being as accommodating as Mignon himself with regard to the opportunities Rose had. The two men got on together better than ever, delighted with their association, so fertile in every kind of happiness, and each one making his nest beside the other, in a home where neither of them any longer stood on ceremony. It was regulated, it worked very well. They rivaled each other in their exertions for the common felicity. It just happened that Mignon had called, by Fauchery's advice, to see if he could not entice away Nana's maid, whose wonderful intelligence the journalist had fully appreciated. Rose was in great distress. For a month past she had had to put up with inexperienced girls who caused her continual embarrassments. As Zoe admitted him, he pushed her at once into the dining room. At the first word she smiled. It was impossible. She was leaving Madame. She was about to set up in business on her own account, and she added, with an air of discreet vanity, that every day she was receiving proposals. All the ladies wanted her. Madame Blanche had offered her a bridge of gold to get her back. Zoe was going to acquire old Tricon's business, an old project which she'd nursed for a long while, an ambition to realize a fortune in which she was about to invest her savings. She was full of great ideas. She dreamed of enlarging the concern, of taking a mansion and collecting in it every pleasure. It was for this that she'd even tried to get hold of Satin, a little blockhead who was now dying in the hospital. She'd so ruined her health. Mignon having persisted in his offer, mentioning the risks one runs in business, Zoe, without explaining herself as to the nature of her projected establishment, contented herself with saying, with a self-satisfied smile, just as though she had taken a confectioner's shop, "Oh, affairs of luxury always succeed. You see, I have been so long with the others that now I wish the others to be with me." And a ferocious feeling made her curl her lip. She would at last be Madame. She would have at her feet, for the sum of a few louis, those women whose slop she'd been emptying for 15 years past. Mignon wished to see Nana, and Zoe left him for a minute, after saying that Madame had passed a very unpleasant day. He had only called there once. He did not know the house at all. The dining room, with its Gobelin tapestry, its sideboard, and its silver plate, amazed him. He familiarly opened the doors and visited the drawing room and the winter garden, and then returned to the hall. And this excessive luxury, the gilded furniture, the silks and the velvets, filled him little by little with an admiration which caused his heart to bump. When Zoe came downstairs to fetch him, she offered to show him the other rooms, the bedroom, the dressing room. Then in the bedroom, Mignon's heart almost burst. He was excited to the highest point of enthusiasm. That confounded Nana astounded him, he who was not easily surprised at anything. In the midst of the downfall of the establishment, of the waste and the massacring gallop of the servants, there was a pile of riches which stopped up the holes and covered the ruins. And Mignon, in the face of that magisterial monument, recalled many great works he had seen. Near Marseille he'd been shown an aqueduct, the stone arches of which spanned an abyss, a cyclopean work which had cost millions and 10 years of struggle. At Cherbourg he'd seen the new harbor in course of construction, a gigantic undertaking, hundreds of men sweating in the sunshine, machines filling the sea with huge masses of rock, erecting a wall where at times workmen were squashed to a bloody pulp. But all that seemed small to him now. Nana exalted him far more, and in contemplating her work, he experienced once again that sensation of respect experienced by him one night at an entertainment in a chateau which a sugar refiner had built, a palace the royal splendor of which had been paid for by one single thing, sugar. She'd paid with something different, a bit of fun at which one laughed, a little of her delicate nudity. It was with this shameful and yet so mighty a nothing, the power of which excited the world, that all alone, without workmen, without machinery invented by engineers, she had shaken Paris and built up that fortune beneath which dead bodies were slumbering. "Ah, damn it all! What a tool!" exclaimed Mignon, enraptured, and with a return of personal gratitude. Nana, little by little, had become very sorrowful. At first, the meeting of the Marquise and the Count had thrown her into a nervous fever, accompanied by a slight touch of gaiety. Then the thought of the old fellow who'd gone off in a cab, half dead, and of her poor Muff whom she would never see again, after having so often vexed him, brought about the beginning of a sentimental melancholy. After this, she'd got quite angry on hearing of Satin's illness. The girl had disappeared a fortnight before, and was now gradually dying at the Lariboisière hospital, Madame Robert having put her into such a frightful state. As she was ordering the carriage to go and see the little baggage once more, Zoe had quietly given her a week's notice to leave. That threw her into despair. It seemed as though she was losing one of her family, and she implored Zoe to remain. The latter, highly flattered by Madame's grief, ended by kissing her, to show there was no ill feeling at parting. She was obliged to go. The heart was silent when business was in question. But that was a day of worries. Nana, thoroughly disgusted, no longer thinking of going out, was wandering about her parlor, when Labordette, who'd come to tell her of some magnificent lace to be had at a bargain, mentioned between two other phrases about nothing at all that Georges was dead. She turned icy cold. "Zizi! Dead!" she cried. And her glance, by an involuntary movement, sought the pink stain on the carpet. But it had vanished at last. The footsteps had worn it away. Labordette, however, gave her some particulars. One did not know exactly how it had happened. Some talked of a wound having opened. Others told the story of a suicide, a plunge into one of the fountains at Les Fondettes. Nana kept repeating, "Dead! Dead!" Then she burst into sobs, and relieved her feelings pent up since the morning. It was an infinite sadness, something profound and immense which overwhelmed her. Labordette having tried to console her about Georges, she waved her hand to make him desist, and said in broken tones, "It's not only him. It's everything. I'm very unhappy. Oh, I know they'll again say that I'm an abominable woman. That mother who's weeping there, and that poor man who was moaning this morning at my door, and the others who are all ruined after having squandered their sous with me. That's right. Give it to Nana. Give it to the beast. Oh, I've a broad back. I can hear them as though I was there. That dirty strumpet who entices everyone, who clears out some and kills the others, who causes pain to no end of people." She was forced to interrupt herself. Suffocated by her tears, she'd fallen in her anguish across a sofa with her head buried in a cushion. The misfortunes she felt around her, those miseries that she had caused, enveloped her in a warm and continuous flow of sensibility, and her voice became lost in the plaintive accents of a little girl. "Oh, I suffer. Oh, I suffer. I cannot. It's stifling me. It's too hard not to be understood, to see everyone put themselves against you because they're the strongest. Yet, when one has nothing to reproach oneself with, when one has a free conscience, well, no. Well, no." Her anger changed to indignation. She got up, wiped her eyes, and paced agitatedly about the room. "Well, No, they may say what they like. It isn't my fault. Am I cruel? I give all I have. I wouldn't hurt a fly. It's they. Yes, it's they. I never wanted to be unpleasant to any of them. And they were always hanging about my skirts, and now they croak or beg, and all pretend to be in despair. Then, stopping in front of Labordette and tapping him on the shoulder, she continued, Come now, you were there. Speak the truth. Was it I who led them on? Weren't there always a dozen exerting themselves to invent something more abominable than the others? They disgusted me. I held myself aloof so as not to follow in their wake. I was afraid. Here's an instance. They all wanted to marry me. A nice idea, eh? Yes, my dear fellow, I might have been 20 times a baroness or a countess if I had consented. Well, I refused because I was reasonable. I preserved them from many detestable actions and many crimes. They would have stolen, murdered, killed father and mother. I had but to say a word, and I didn't say it. Today you see my reward. It's like that Dagonet whom I got married, a half-starved wretch whose position I made after keeping him for nothing for weeks together. Yesterday I met him. He turned away his head. Well, go to the devil, pig. I'm not so foul as you are. She was walking about again. She violently banged her fist down on a small round table. Damn it all! It's not just. Society is badly constructed. The women are abused when it's the men who are entirely to blame. They expect such things. Listen, I can tell you now, in all I've ever had to do with men, well, I never had the least pleasure. No, not the least. They always bored me, on my word of honor. So I ask you now if there's any fault of mine in all this. Ah, yes, they almost badgered me out of my life. Without them, my dear fellow, and what they've made of me, I should be now in a convent praying, for I've always been religious. And, hang 'em, after all, if they have left their money and their skin, it's their own fault. I've nothing to do with it. Of course, said Labordette, convinced. Zoe ushered in Mignon. Nana received him smiling. She had had a good cry, but now it was over. He complimented her on her abode, still warmed with enthusiasm. But she soon let him see that she had had enough of her mansion. Now she was dreaming of something else. She would get rid of it all one fine day. Then, as he mentioned as a pretext for his visit a benefit performance to be given for old Bosc, who was tied to his chair by an attack of paralysis, she expressed a great deal of sorrow and took 2 boxes. Zoe, however, having said that the carriage was waiting, she asked for her bonnet. And as she tied the strings, she related the story of poor Satin's mishap. I'm off to the hospital. No one ever loved me as she did. Ah, one is quite right in accusing men of having no hearts. Who knows? She's perhaps dead already. All the same, I shall ask to see her. I must kiss her once more. Labordette and Mignon smiled. She was no longer sad. She smiled also, for those 2 did not count. They could understand. And they both admired her in a thoughtful silence as she finished buttoning her gloves. She alone stood erect in the midst of the piled-up wealth of her mansion, where the crowd of men trampled beneath her feet. Like those antique monsters whose dreaded domain was covered with bones, she trod on skulls, and catastrophe surrounded her. Vandouver's furious conflagration, the melancholy of Foucault drowned in the China seas, the collapse of Steiner, now forced to live as an honest man, the satisfied imbecility of La Falloise, and the tragical downfall of the Muffats, and Georges' white corpse watched over by Philippe, discharged from prison the day before. A work of ruin and death was accomplished. The fly that had taken its flight from the filth of the slums, carrying with it the ferment of social decay, had poisoned those men merely by touching them. It was good. It was just. She had avenged her people, the rogues and the vagabonds from whom she sprang. and whilst in a halo her sex ascended and shone on her scattered victims like a rising sun lighting up a field of carnage, she retained her unconsciousness of a superb beast, ignorant of her work, always good-natured. She remained big and plump, with beautiful health and unalloyed gaiety. But all that no longer counted. Her mansion seemed to her idiotic. It was so small and full of a heap of furniture which was always in her way. A mere nothing. She only wanted to commence again. She dreamed, too, of something better. And she went off in a gorgeous costume to kiss satin a last time. Clean, solid, looking quite new, as though she had never been in use. This ends Chapter 13, Part 3 of Nana. Chapter 14 of Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rasco. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mark Leader. Chapter 14 of Nana. Nana abruptly disappeared. Another plunge, a wild prank, a flight into strange lands. Before her departure, she procured herself the emotion of a sale by auction, sweeping everything off. The mansion, the furniture, the jewelry, and even the dresses and the linen. Figures were quoted. The 5 days produced more than 600,000 francs. For a last time Paris had seen her in a fairy piece, Mélusine at the Gaiety Theatre, that Bordenave had audaciously taken without a sou. She was there with Prullière and Fontaine. Her part was a dumb one, all show, but a real hit. 3 plastic postures of a powerful and silent fairy. Then, in the midst of this great success, when Bordenave, advertising mad, was covering Paris with colossal posters, it was stated one fine morning that the night before she had left for Cairo. A simple discussion with her manager, a word that had not pleased her, the caprice of a woman too rich to allow herself to be annoyed. Besides, it was a fad of hers. For a long time past she had longed to go and see the Turks. Months passed by. She was forgotten. Whenever her name was mentioned amongst her friends, the strangest stories circulated. Each gave contrary and prodigious information. She had captivated the viceroy. She reigned in the innermost recesses of a palace over 200 slaves whose heads she cut off to make her laugh. Not at all. She had ruined herself with a big Negro, a filthy infatuation which had left her without a chemise in the midst of the crapulous debauchery of Cairo. A fortnight later there was universal astonishment. Someone swore he'd met her in Russia. A legend gradually developed. She was the mistress of a prince. Her diamonds were talked about. All the women were soon acquainted with them through the descriptions that were current, without anyone being able to give their source. Rings, bracelets, earrings, a diamond necklace as broad as 2 fingers, and a queenly diadem surrounded by a central brilliant as big as one's thumb. In the unknown of these far-off lands, she assumed the mysterious radiance of an idol covered with precious stones. Now she was only mentioned gravely, with the pensive respect for that fortune made amongst the barbarians. One July evening, towards 8 o'clock, Lucy, who was driving down the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, caught sight of Caroline Eke, who had gone out on foot to give an order to a tradesman of the neighborhood. She called to her, and at once said, "Have you dined? Are you free? Oh, then, my dear, come with me. Nana has returned." The other, on hearing this, at once got into the carriage, and Lucy continued, "And you know, my dear, she's perhaps dead whilst we are talking." "Dead? What an idea!" cried Caroline in amazement. "And where? And of what?" "At the Grand Hotel, of the smallpox. Oh, quite a story." Lucy had told her coachman to drive quick. So as the horses rapidly trotted along the Rue Royale and the boulevards, she related the story of Nana's adventure. in broken sentences and without once taking breath. You can't imagine. Nana arrives from Russia, I forget why. A row with her prince. She leaves her luggage at the station and goes off to her aunt. You recollect that old woman? Good. She finds her baby ill with the smallpox. The baby dies on the morrow, and she has a row with the aunt about the money she ought to have sent, and which the other had never seen a sou of. It seems the child died of that. In short, the child was not well fed or looked after. Very well, Nana goes off, puts up at a hotel, then meets Mignon, just as she was thinking of fetching her luggage. She becomes very peculiar. She has the shivers, wants to be sick, and Mignon takes her to her room, promising to look after her affairs. Isn't it funny? Isn't it strange? But here's the best part. Rose hears of Nana's illness, is indignant at learning that she's all alone in an out-of-the-way place, and weepingly hastens to nurse her. You recollect how they detested each other? A couple of furies. Well, my dear, Rose had Nana removed to the Grand Hotel, so that she might at least die in a swell place. And she's already passed 3 nights with her, and may very likely die of it afterwards. It's Labordette who told me all this, so I wanted to see— Yes, interrupted Caroline, greatly excited. We will go. They had arrived. On the boulevard, the coachman had been obliged to pull up in the midst of a block of vehicles and foot passengers. During the day, the Corps Législatif had voted for a declaration of war. A crowd poured down from all the side streets and covered the footpaths and the roadway. At the Madeleine end, the sun had set behind a blood-red cloud, the fiery reflection of which illuminated the tall windows. Twilight was coming on, a dull and melancholy hour, with the darkening avenues, which the gas lamps had not yet lit up with their bright specks. And amongst this mass of people on the march, distant voices became louder, pale faces sparkled with animated glances, whilst a deep breath of anguish and of spreading stupor turned all heads. "There's Mignon," said Lucy. "He will give us some news." Mignon was standing under the vast portico of the Grand Hotel, with a nervous air about him as he watched the crowd. At the first questions Lucy put to him, he flew into a passion, exclaiming, "I don't know. For the last 2 days I've not been able to get Rose away from up there. It's idiotic for her to risk her skin like that. She'll look nice if she catches it, with scars all over her face. It will suit us nicely." The idea that Rose might lose her beauty exasperated him. He would leave Nana just as she was, not understanding those silly devotions which women went in for. But here Fauchery crossed the boulevard, and when he had joined the others he also anxiously asked for news. And then the 2 men tried to incite each other to go up. They were most affectionate to one another now. "Always the same, little un," observed Mignon. "You ought to go up and force her to come away." "Really, you're kind, you are," said the journalist. "Why don't you go up yourself?" Then, as Lucy inquired the number of the room, they both implored her to induce Rose to come down, otherwise it would end by their getting angry. Lucy and Caroline, however, did not go up at once. They had caught sight of Fontaine strolling along with his hands in his pockets, highly amused by the different faces in the crowd. When he learnt that Nana was upstairs ill, he remarked with a great display of feeling, "Poor girl! I will go and shake hands with her." "What's the matter with her?" "Smallpox," replied Mignon. The actor had already taken a step in the direction of the courtyard, but he retraced it, and with a shiver simply murmured, "Ah, the deuce!" It was no joke catching smallpox. Fontaine had nearly had it when he was 5 years old. Mignon related the story of one of his nieces who had died of it. As for Fauchery, he could talk of it, for he still bore the marks, 3 spots which he showed to the others, close to his nose, and as Mignon pressed him again to go up, on the pretext that people never had it twice, he violently disputed that theory. He instanced cases and called the doctors fools. But Lucy and Caroline, surprised at the vast increase of the crowd, interrupted them. Look there! Look there! What a mob of people!" The night was advancing. The lamps in the distance were being lighted one by one. One could, however, distinguish spectators at the windows, whilst under the trees the human tide swelled every minute in one long stream from the Madeleine to the Bastille. The vehicles rolled slowly along. A kind of buzz arose from that compact mass, dumb as yet, assembled together in the idle desire of forming a crowd, stamping and excited with the same fever. But a huge commotion caused the crowd to fall back. In the midst of all the jostling, passing through the groups that made way for them, a band of men in caps and white blouses appeared, uttering this cry, to the time of hammers beating on the anvil: "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" And the crowd looked on with a gloomy distrust, already attracted, nevertheless, and stirred with visions of heroic deeds, the same as when a military band passes by. "Yes, yes, go and get your heads broken," murmured Mignon, seized with a philosophic fit. But Fontaine thought it very grand. He talked of enlisting. When the enemy was at the frontier, all citizens ought to rise in arms to defend the fatherland, and he assumed a posture worthy of Bonaparte at Austerlitz. "Well, are you going up with us?" asked Lucy of him. "Ah, no," said he, "not to get ill." On one of the seats in front of the Grand Hotel sat a man, hiding his face in his handkerchief. Fauchery, on arriving, had drawn Mignon's attention to him with a wink. So he was always there? Yes, he was always there, and the journalist stopped the two women to point him out to them. As he raised his head they recognized him and uttered a slight exclamation. It was Count Muffat, who glanced upwards at one of the windows. "You know, he's been there ever since this morning," related Mignon. "I saw him at 6 o'clock. He has scarcely moved since. At the first words Labordette uttered, he came and posted himself there with his handkerchief over his face. Every half hour he crawls as far as here to inquire if the person upstairs is better, and then returns to his seat. Well, you know, it's not healthy, that room. One may love people without wishing to croak." The Count, with upturned eyes, did not appear to be aware of what was going on around him. No doubt he was ignorant of a declaration of war. He neither felt nor heard the crowd. "Look," said Fauchery, "here he comes. Now just watch him." The Count had indeed quitted his seat, and had entered under the lofty doorway. But the doorkeeper, who by this time had become accustomed to him, did not give him time to repeat his question. He said abruptly, "Sir, she died just a minute ago." Nana dead? It was a blow for all of them. Muffat, without a word, returned to the seat, his face buried in his handkerchief. The others cried out, but their voices were abruptly drowned as another crowd passed along, yelling, "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Nana dead. Was it possible? Such a fine girl. Mignon sighed with relief. Rose would at last come down. There ensued a coolness. Fontaine, who was longing for a tragic part, assumed an expression of grief, his mouth drawn down, his eyes turned up to the lids, whilst Fauchery, really affected in spite of his journalistic affectation of ridiculing everything, nervously champed his cigar. The two women, however, could not suppress their exclamations. The last time that Lucy had seen her was at the Gaiety Theatre, Blanche also, in Mélusine. Oh, she was grand, my dear, when she appeared in the midst of the crystal grotto. The gentlemen recollected very well. Fontaine played Prince Cocorico, and their memories awakened. They launched forth into interminable details. In the crystal grotto, was she not just fine with her rich nature? She did not say a word. The authors had even struck out a cue because it interfered. No, nothing at all. It was far grander. and she electrified the audience merely by showing herself. A form such as one will never see again. Such shoulders, such legs, and such a waist. How queer that she should be dead. You know that over her tights she simply wore a golden sash round the hips, which was scarcely sufficient. Around her, the grotto, all in glass, sparkled. There were cascades of diamonds, and strings of pearls trickled down amongst the stalactites of the roof. And in that transparency, in that pellucid spring, intersected by a broad ray of electric light, she appeared like a sun, with her skin and her hair of fire. Paris would ever see her thus, beaming in the midst of the crystal, poised in the air like a goddess. No, it was too stupid to allow oneself to die in such a position. Now she must be a pretty sight up there. "And what pleasure wasted," said Mignon, in the melancholy voice of a man who does not like to see good and useful things cast away. He sounded Lucy and Caroline to know if they still had the intention of going upstairs. Most certainly they were going up. Their curiosity had increased. Just then Blanche arrived, all out of breath, and exasperated with the crowd which blocked all the footpaths. And when she learnt the news, the exclamations recommenced. The ladies moved towards the staircase, making a great noise with their skirts. Mignon followed them, calling out, "Tell Rose I'm waiting for her. At once, please." "One doesn't know for certain whether the contagion is most to be feared at the commencement or towards the end," Fontaine was explaining to Fauchery. "A house surgeon I know even assured me that the hours which follow death are most especially dangerous. Miasmata are expelled from the corpse. Ah, I regret this sudden end. I should have been so glad to have shaken her hand the last time." "What good would it do now?" asked the journalist. "Yes, what good?" repeated the other two. The crowd continued to increase. In the flood of light from the shops, beneath the dancing sheets of flaring gas, one could distinguish a sea of hats drifting in a double current along the footpaths. At this time the fever was passing from one to another. People joined the bands in blouses. A continuous pushing swept the roadway, and the cry returned, issuing from every throat, jerky and obstinate. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Upstairs on the 4th floor, the room cost 12 francs a day. Rose, having desired something decent, without being luxurious, however, for one does not want luxury when suffering, hung in Louis XIII cretonne with large flowers. The room contained the mahogany furniture peculiar to all hotels, and a red carpet sprinkled with black foliage. A heavy silence reigned there, broken only by a whisper when voices resounded in the corridor. "I tell you, we've lost our way. The waiter told us to turn to the right. What a barrack! Wait a minute. Let's see. Room 401. Room 401. Here, this way. 405, 403. This must be it. Ah, at last. 401. Come, hush, hush." The voices ceased. There was a slight coughing, then a momentary pause, and the door opened slowly, admitting Lucy, followed by Caroline and Blanche. But they halted. There were already 5 women in the room. Gaga was stretched out in the only easy-chair, one in red velvet. Simone and Clarisse, standing in front of the fireplace, were conversing with Léa Dehorn, seated on a chair, whilst before the bed, to the left of the door, Rose Mignon, leaning against the woodwork of the foot, was looking fixedly at the corpse, lost in the shadow of the curtains. All the others had their bonnets and gloves on, like ladies out visiting. She only had bare hands, and her hair in disorder, her face pale with the fatigue of 3 nights of nursing. And there she stood, feeling stupid, with her features swollen from weeping, in the presence of that so sudden death. On the corner of a chest of drawers, a lamp with a shade lighted up Gaga with a brilliant flood of light. "Ah, what a misfortune!" murmured Lucy, as she squeezed Rose's hand. "We wanted to bid her good-bye." And she turned her head to catch a glimpse of Nana, but the lamp was too far off, and she did not like to move it nearer. On the bed a grey mass lay stretched out. One could only distinguish the golden chignon and a palish-looking spot, which was probably the face. Lucy added, "I have never seen her since she was at the Gaiety Theatre in the grotto." Then Rose, shaking off her torpor, smiled and said, "Ah, she is altered. She is altered." And she returned to her contemplation, without a gesture, without a word. Perhaps they would be able to look at her by, and the three women joined the others in front of the fireplace. Simone and Clarisse were talking in an undertone about the deceased's diamonds. Now, did they really exist, those diamonds? No one had seen them. It was probably all bosh. But Léa de Horn knew someone who was acquainted with them. Oh, some monstrous stones. Besides, that wasn't all. She'd brought heaps of other riches from Russia. Embroidered stuffs, precious knickknacks, a service of gold plate, and even furniture. Yes, my dear, 52 articles, some enormous cases, sufficient to load 3 luggage vans. It was all at the station. Ah, she had no luck, to die without even having time to unpack her things. And bear in mind that she had also some sous beside all these, something like 1 million. Lucy inquired who would inherit it all. Some distant relatives, the aunt very likely. A fine windfall for that old woman. She knew nothing yet. The invalid obstinately refused to have her informed, bearing her some ill will for the death of her youngster. Then they all pitied the little fellow, as they recollected having seen him at the races. A baby full of disease, and who looked so sad and so old. In short, one of those poor brats who never wanted to be born. "He's far happier in his grave," said Blanche. "Bah!" And she also added Caroline. "Life isn't so pleasant after all." Gloomy ideas possessed them, in the severity of that chamber of death. They were afraid. It was stupid to remain talking there so long, but a desire to see kept them rooted to the spot. It was very warm. The lamp glass shone on the ceiling like a moon in the damp shadow which filled the apartment. Under the bed, a soup plate full of some disinfectant exhaled a most unsavory odor. And now and again a slight breath of air swelled the curtains of the window, opened on to the boulevard, from whence arose a dull, murmuring sound. "Did she suffer much?" asked Lucy, who'd been absorbed in the group above the clock. The 3 Graces, naked and smiling like opera dancers. Gaga appeared to wake up. "Ah, yes, she did. I was there when she passed away. I can tell you that there's nothing beautiful in it. She was seized with a shivering fit." But she could not continue her explanation. A cry arose. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" And Lucy, who was stifling, opened the window wide and leant out on the balustrade. There it was pleasant. A delightful coolness came from the starry sky. On the opposite side of the way, windows were ablaze with light, whilst the reflections of the gas danced among the gilded letters of the signs. Then down the street it was very amusing. One could see the currents of the crowd roll like a torrent along the footpaths and the roadway, in the midst of a block of vehicles and large moving shadows, among which the lights of the shops and of the street lamps sparkled. But the band, that now approached with loud shouts, carried torches. A ray of red light came from the direction of the Madeleine, dividing the mob with a trail of fire, spreading afar over the heads like the reflection of a conflagration. Lucy, forgetting where she was, called to Blanche and Caroline, exclaiming, "Come quick! You can see very well from here." All 3 leant out, greatly interested. The trees interfered with their view. At times the torches disappeared beneath the foliage. They tried to catch a glimpse of the gentleman waiting below, but the projection of a balcony hid the hotel entrance, and they could only distinguish Count Muffat, still huddled up on the seat like a dark bundle, his face buried in his handkerchief. A carriage had stopped, and Lucy recognized Maria Blonde, another one who was hastening there. She was not alone. A stout man got out after her. "Why, it's that thief Steiner," said Caroline. "What, hasn't he been packed back to Cologne yet? I shall like to see how he looks when he comes in." They turned round, but at the expiration of 10 minutes, when Maria Blonde appeared, after having twice mistaken the staircase, she was alone, and as Lucy questioned her with surprise, she exclaimed, "He? Ah, my dear, you made a mistake if you thought he was coming up. It's even wonderful for him that he came as far as the door with me. There's about a dozen of them downstairs, all smoking cigars." In truth, all those gentlemen were there, come for a stroll, just to see what was going on the boulevards. They'd met together and launched forth exclamations on the poor girl's death. Then they lapsed into politics and strategy. Bordenave, Daguenet, Labordette, Pullier, and others had swelled the group, and they were listening to Fontaine, who was explaining his plan of campaign for capturing Berlin in 5 days. However, Maria Blonde, seized with compassion before the bed, was murmuring, as the others had done, "Poor dear, the last time I saw her was at the Gaiety Theatre, in the grotto. Ah, she's altered. She is altered," repeated Rose Mignon, with her smile of dull grief. 2 more women arrived, Tétane Néné and Louise Violaine. They'd been wandering about the hotel for quite 20 minutes, sent from waiter to waiter. They'd gone up and down more than 30 flights of stairs, in the midst of a host of travelers who were flying from Paris, in the panic caused by the declaration of war and the commotion on the boulevards. So, immediately on entering the room, they sank into some chairs, too fatigued to think of the deceased. Just then a great noise was heard in the next apartment. There was a moving of trunks, a knocking about of furniture, mingled with the sound of voices uttering barbarous accents. The room was occupied by a young Austrian couple. Gaga related that, during the death agony, the pair had played at running after each other, and as there was a door between the 2 rooms, one could hear them laughing and kissing each time one of them was caught. "Well, I must be off," said Clarisse. "We can't bring her to life again. Are you coming, Simone?" They all glanced at the bed, without stirring. Yet they were getting ready to leave. They gently smoothed down their skirts. At the window, Lucy was again leaning out, but alone. A sadness brought a lump to her throat, as though a profound melancholy arose from that yelling mob beneath. Torches continued to pass, casting flakes of fire around. In the distance, the various bands, huddled together in the darkness, looked like flocks of sheep driven at night time to the slaughter-house. And all that giddiness, those confused masses surging like the ocean, exhaled a terror, a great pity for coming massacres. They banished dull care. Their shouts burst out in the intoxication of their fever, rushing against the unknown, far away in the distance, behind the dark boundary of the horizon. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Lucy turned round, her back against the balustrade of the window, and looking very pale, exclaimed, "Good heavens! What will become of us?" The other women shook their heads. They were very grave and full of anxiety about what was happening. "I," said Caroline Hiquet in her sedate way, "I'm off to London the day after tomorrow. Mamma is already there preparing a house for me. I'm certainly not going to stop in Paris to be massacred." Her mother, like a prudent woman, had invested all her money abroad. One never knows how a war may end. But Maria Blonde flew into a passion. She was patriotic. She talked of following the army. "There's a runaway for you! Yes, if they would let me, I would dress up as a man and go and shoot those Prussian pigs. And if we were all to croak, what next? A pretty thing our bodies are!" Blanche de Cifré was exasperated. "Don't speak against the Prussians. They are men like the others, and are not forever bothering women like your Frenchmen. They've just expelled the little Prussian who was with me, a fellow awfully rich and gentle as a lamb, incapable of hurting anyone. It's a disgrace. It'll ruin me. And do you know, if I'm bothered too much, I'll go and join him in Germany." Then, whilst each had her say, Gaga murmured in a doleful voice, "It's the end. I've no luck. Only a week ago I paid the last installment for my little house at Juvisy. Heaven knows what trouble it cost me. Lily had to help me. And now war's declared. The Prussians will come. They'll burn everything. How can I commence all over again at my age?" "Of course," added Simone, "it will be funny. Perhaps, on the contrary, we shall do—" And she completed her thought with a smile. Tétane Néné and Louise Violaine were of the same opinion. The first one related that she had had some jolly times with soldiers. Having raised their voices too high, Rose Mignon, still leaning against the woodwork at the foot of the bed, made them leave off with a gentle "Hush!" They were startled and glanced sideways towards the corpse, as though that request for silence had issued from the very shadow of the curtains. And in the heavy quiet that prevailed, that quiet of nothingness in which they were conscious of the rigidity of the corpse stretched out near them, the shouts of the mob burst out again. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" But they soon forgot their fright. Léa de Horn, who had a political salon where some of Louis Philippe's ex-ministers indulged in smart epigrams, resumed in a low voice as she shrugged her shoulders. "What a mistake this war! What awful stupidity!" Then Lucy at once defended the Empire. She'd been kept by one of the imperial princes. For her it was a family matter. "Nonsense, my dear. We couldn't allow ourselves to be insulted any longer. This war is the honor of France. Oh, you know, I don't say that because of the prince. He was so stingy. Just fancy, every night he hid his louis in his boots, and whenever we played at Bézique he used beans, because one day I seized the stakes, just for a joke. But that doesn't prevent my being just. The emperor was in the right." Léa wagged her head with an air of superiority, like a woman who repeats the opinions of eminent personages. And raising her voice, she added, "It's the end. We're all mad at the Tuileries. France ought to have sent them to the right about yesterday rather than—" The others violently interrupted her. She was cracked. What was the matter with her? What had the emperor ever done to her? Wasn't everyone happy? Wasn't business in a flourishing state? Paris could never be livelier. Gaga flew into a passion, roused with indignation. "Shut up! It's idiotic! You don't know what you're saying. I lived in Louis Philippe's time, an epoch of toast and water and sordidness, my dear. And then came 48. A fine thing, a disgusting time, their republic. After February I was actually starving, I tell you. But if you had passed through all that, you would fall on your knees before the emperor, for he's been our father. Yes, our father." They had to calm her. Then she resumed in a religious outburst. "Oh God, give the emperor the victory. Preserve us the empire." All repeated the prayer. Blanche admitted that she burnt candles for the emperor. Caroline, full of her religious feeling, had for 2 months past gone everywhere that she was likely to come across him without succeeding in attracting his notice. And the others broke out into furious tirades against the Republicans, talking of expelling them beyond the frontier, so that Napoleon III, after vanquishing the enemy, might reign peacefully in the midst of the universal joy. "That beast Bismarck, there's a scoundrel for you," observed Maria Blonde. "To think that I once knew him," cried Simon. "If I had only known, I would have put some poison in his glass." But Blanche, still feeling aggrieved at the expulsion of her Prussian, dared to take Bismarck's part. He wasn't a bit wicked. Each one had his own duties. She added, "You know, he adores women." "What's that to us?" said Clarisse. You don't think we want him, do you?" "There are always too many men like him," gravely declared Louise Violin. "We'd better do without them altogether than have any acquaintance with such monsters." And the discussion continued. They pulled Bismarck to pieces. Each one gave him a kick in her Bonapartist zeal, whilst Tatan Nene said in a vexed manner, "Bismarck! How they used to tease me about him! Oh, I owe him a grudge. I'd never heard of him, that Bismarck. One can't know everyone." "All the same," said Lea de Horn conclusively, "that Bismarck's going to give us a good hiding." She was unable to continue. The other women all flew at her. "Eh? What? A hiding? It was Bismarck who was going to be sent back home, with kicks behind. She'd better shut up. She was unworthy to be a Frenchwoman." "Hush!" whispered Rose Mignon, feeling hurt at such a noise. The frigidity of the corpse again impressed them. They all ceased talking, uneasy, and brought anew face to face with death, with the secret dread of evil. On the boulevard the cry passed, hoarse and rending, "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" Then, just as they were making up their minds to leave, a voice called from the corridor, "Rose! Rose!" Gaga, surprised, opened the door and disappeared for a moment. Then, when she returned, she said, "My dear, it's Fauchery who is there at the end of the passage. He won't come any nearer. He's in an awful state because you persist in remaining here with the body." Mignon had succeeded in inciting the journalist. Lucy, still at the window, leaned out, and she caught sight of a gentleman waiting on the pavement, looking up and making signs to her. Mignon, exasperated, was holding up his fists. Steiner, Fontaine, Bordenave, and the others were opening their arms in an anxious and reproachful way, whilst Daguenet, so as not to compromise himself, was quietly smoking his cigar, his hands behind his back. "I was forgetting, my dear," said Lucy, leaving the window open. "I promised to make you go down. They're all beckoning for us." Rose moved away painfully from the foot of the bedstead. She murmured, "I will go down. I will go down. She no longer wants me now. We will send for a sister of charity." And she looked about without being able to find her bonnet and shawl. She mechanically filled a basin with water at the washstand and washed her hands and face as she continued, "I don't know how it is, but it's been a great shock to me. We were not very nice to each other. Well, now I feel quite stupid. Oh, I've all sorts of ideas. A longing to die myself. The end of the world. Yes, I want some fresh air." The dead body was beginning to fill the room with a fearful stench. There was quite a panic after such a long period of unconcern. "Let's be off. Let's be off, my dears," repeated Gaga. "It isn't healthy." They left the room quickly, throwing another glance towards the bed. But as Lucy, Blanche, and Caroline were still there, Rose gave a last look round to see that all was tidy. She drew the curtain before the window. Then she thought that the lamp was not proper, there ought to be a candle, and after taking one of the brass candlesticks from the mantelpiece, she lit the candle and placed it on the night table beside the corpse. A bright light suddenly illuminated the face of the deceased. It was horrible. They shuddered and hastened away. "Ah, she is altered. She is altered," murmured Rose Mignon, who was the last to leave the room. She went off and closed the door. Nana was left alone, her face turned upwards in the candlelight. It was a charnel house, a mass of matter and blood, a shovelful of putrid flesh, thrown there on the cushion. The pustules had invaded the entire face, one touching the other, and, faded, sunk in with the greyish aspect of mud, they already seemed like a mouldiness of the earth on that shapeless pulp, in which the features were no longer recognizable. One of the eyes, the left one, had completely disappeared amidst the eruption of the purulence. The other, half open, looked like a black and tainted hole. The nose still continued to suppurate. A reddish crust starting from one of the cheeks invaded the mouth, which it distorted in an abominable laugh. And on this horrible and grotesque mask of nothingness, the hair, that beautiful hair, retaining its sun-like fire, fell in a stream of gold. Venus was decomposing. It seemed as if the virus gathered by her in the gutters from a tolerated carrion, that ferment with which she had poisoned a people, had ascended to her face and rotted it. The room was deserted. A strong breath of despair mounted from the boulevard and swelled the curtain. "To Berlin! To Berlin! To Berlin!" This ends chapter 14 of Nana. This ends Nana by Émile Zola, translated by Burton Rasco.